Good evening, and welcome back. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to hold in your hands a piece of clay, small enough to fit in your palm, that someone pressed their fingers into thousands of years ago? A piece of clay that carries, in its careful rows of wedge-shaped marks, the memory of a world that ended before our own began. Have you ever considered that somewhere beneath the dry soil of the ancient Near East, scribes once sat by lamplight and recorded not just their own history, but the history of everything that came before, civilizations they believed had risen and fallen in the deep time before the Great Flood washed the earth clean? If this kind of question stirs something quiet in you, something that reaches toward the long dark of human memory, then this channel may be exactly the place you have been looking for. If you find that these slow journeys through the ancient world help you rest, help you breathe a little more easily at the end of a long day, please consider leaving a like and subscribing, only if it genuinely brings you something. And if you feel so inclined, drop your location and your local time in the comments below. It is always a quiet pleasure to know where in the world these words are finding you tonight. Now, find a comfortable position. Dim the lights if you can, or let the darkness settle around you naturally. Perhaps there is a fan turning somewhere nearby, or the sound of rain against a window. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow just a little. Now let us ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins not with the tablet itself, but with the land that made it possible. A flat, sun-baked plain between two rivers, where the air in summer smelled of warm mud, and the sky at night was so clear and so vast that the people who lived beneath it felt with complete certainty that the stars were watching them back. That land was ancient Mesopotamia, the region we now call southern Iraq, and it was one of the most unlikely places on Earth for a civilization to take root. The soil was fertile, yes, extraordinarily so, but the rivers that made it fertile were also unpredictable and sometimes violent. The Tigris and the Euphrates, those two great arteries of the ancient world, did not flow gently and evenly through the seasons. They rose and fell with a rhythm that could be generous or catastrophic, and the people who chose to settle along their banks understood from the very beginning that they were living in negotiation with forces far larger than themselves. Picture the landscape in those earlier centuries, long before any city had been built, long before any clay had been pressed into the shape of a word. The plains stretched in every direction, flat and enormous, broken only by the shimmer of water channels and the dark green lines of reed beds along the river margins. The reeds themselves were remarkable. Tall, dense, hollow-stemmed, and extraordinarily useful. They could be woven into mats, bundled into boats, shaped into shelters, and burned for warmth. They rustled in the hot wind with a sound like distant conversation, and the birds that nested in them added their own voices to that constant low murmur. The earliest people who moved through this landscape did not yet farm in any organised way. They were hunters and gatherers, following the seasonal movements of animals, harvesting the wild grains that grew along the river margins, fishing with woven traps in the shallower channels. They knew the land intimately, every bend in the river, every place where the ground rose just enough to stay dry during flood season, every stand of date palms heavy with fruit in the autumn months. Their knowledge was precise and accumulated over generations, passed from parent to child, not in writing, for writing did not yet exist, but in story and song and careful demonstration. They watched the sky with the same attention they gave to the ground. The movements of the moon told them when the river would rise. The appearance of certain star clusters told them when to expect the dry season's end. The Milky Way stretched overhead on clear nights like a river of pale fire, and it is not difficult to imagine that the people below, standing in the darkness beside their actual rivers, felt a kind of kinship with that celestial stream, as if the world above and the world below were mirrors of each other, each reflecting the other's patterns in endless repetition. These early inhabitants of the southern plain left behind almost nothing that we can point to and name. They had no cities, no temples, no written records. What they left was subtler. Traces in the soil, charred seeds, fragments of bone, the occasional worked flint blade. Archaeologists who have excavated the deep layers beneath the great Mesopotamian cities have found these traces, and from them have pieced together a picture of life that was, in its own way, complete. These were not primitive people in any diminishing sense of the word. They were fully human, fully intelligent, fully capable of wonder and grief, and the long, careful transmission of knowledge. They simply had not yet invented the tools that would allow them to store that knowledge outside of living memory. And that, in a way, is where our story truly begins, with the problem of memory itself. How do you hold on to what you know when you are mortal and your knowledge is not? How do you pass the most important things forward across the generations, intact, undistorted, safe from the erosion of time? Every human culture that has ever existed has grappled with this question, and the answers have been as varied as the cultures themselves. Some built monuments, some carved images into rock, some developed elaborate systems of oral recitation, training specialists whose entire lives were devoted to memorizing and repeating the accumulated wisdom of their people. And some, in a handful of places around the ancient world, eventually arrived at writing. But before writing, there was a long period, thousands of years long, during which the peoples of Mesopotamia developed and refined the oral traditions that would eventually find their way onto clay. The stories they told around their fires, the cosmological explanations they gave for the shape of the world, the genealogies of gods and kings that anchored their sense of identity and time, all of these existed first as spoken words, carried in the minds of storytellers and priests, shaped and reshaped by each generation that received and passed them on. Among these stories, there were certain recurring themes that seem to have been very old indeed, older, perhaps, than the civilizations that eventually recorded them. One of these themes was the idea that the world had not always been as it was now, that there had been earlier times, earlier peoples, earlier ways of living, which had been swept away by some great catastrophe and replaced by the present order. This idea, which scholars sometimes call the myth of successive ages, or the doctrine of world ages, appears in cultures from Mesopotamia to India to Greece to Mesoamerica, and its widespread presence suggests that it taps into something deep in human experience. Perhaps the universal observation that things change, that what was once great can fall, that the world one inherits is not the world one's ancestors knew. In Mesopotamia, this idea would eventually crystallize into a very specific form, the belief that before the Great Flood there had been a series of kings, or perhaps civilizations, stretching back into a time so remote that the numbers used to describe it strained the limits of ordinary arithmetic. These antediluvian rulers, as scholars would later call them, were said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years each. Their cities were named, their accomplishments were hinted at, and then, the text said, the flood came and swept everything away and the world began again. The tablet that records this tradition, or rather, the several tablets and fragments that together constitute what we now call the Sumerian King List, is one of the most extraordinary documents to survive from the ancient world. It is not the only text that touches on these themes, and it must be read alongside other works, the Eridu Genesis, the Epic of Atrahasis, the Great Gilgamesh Cycle, to be fully understood. But it is, in its quiet, bureaucratic, almost matter-of-fact way, one of the most haunting, because it does not dramatize the world before the flood. It simply lists it, name after name, city after city, reign after reign, in the same flat administrative tone that a modern clerk might use to record the contents of a warehouse. And then, at a certain point in the list, there is a single line that changes everything. The flood swept over the earth, and after the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven again. That line, so brief, so calm, so utterly without elaboration, is the hinge point of tonight's story. On one side of it lies everything that came before, on the other side lies everything we know as history, and in the space between, in the silence of that single sentence, lies a world that the ancient scribes believed had existed and been lost, a world they called, in their careful way, the time before the flood. To understand what they meant and what they were trying to preserve, we need to understand how they lived, how they thought, and how they came to develop the remarkable technology of writing that made it possible to record such things at all. And that understanding begins, as so many things do in the ancient world, with the land itself, with the mud and the water and the reeds, with the slow seasonal rhythms of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and with the quiet, patient intelligence of the people who learned to read those rhythms and eventually to write them down. The climate of ancient Mesopotamia was not so different from what it is today in its broad outlines, though scholars believe that in the very earliest periods of human settlement, the region may have been somewhat wetter and more hospitable than the dry, sun-scorched landscape it would later become. The great rivers flooded each spring, carrying snowmelt from the mountains of Anatolia and the Zagros range down through the long, flat plain to the Persian Gulf. These floods were not always gentle. They could be sudden and violent, covering vast areas of the low-lying plain with water that might remain for weeks or months before receding. When the water pulled back, it left behind a thick layer of fine silt, some of the most fertile soil on Earth, and it was in this soil that the first farmers of the region planted their barley and their emmer wheat and their lentils. Farming changed everything. It changed the relationship between people and the land. It changed the size of communities that could be sustained in a given area. It changed the nature of social organization, because farming requires coordination, deciding who plants what, who controls the water channels, who stores the surplus grain, who distributes it in lean years. And it changed, profoundly, the relationship between people and time. A farmer lives in a different relationship to the future than a hunter-gatherer does. A farmer plants in spring knowing that the harvest will come in autumn, a span of months during which the planted seed must be tended and protected. A farmer thinks in seasons, in years, in the cycles of planting and harvest that accumulate into a lifetime and then continue after that lifetime ends. Farming is, in a sense, a practice of intergenerational memory. The earliest farming villages in Mesopotamia date to roughly the 7th millennium before the Common Era, and over the following millennia they grew in size and complexity. By around 5000 BCE, something remarkable was happening in the southernmost part of the plain, in the region that would later be known as Sumer. Villages were growing into towns, and towns were beginning to organize themselves around central structures. Large buildings that served as communal storage facilities, administrative centers, and eventually temples. These early temples were not yet the towering ziggurats that would later define the Mesopotamian skyline. They were modest mud brick structures, raised slightly above the surrounding ground on low platforms, their walls perhaps decorated with simple geometric patterns pressed into the wet clay before it dried. But even in their modest early form, these temples represented something important. They were places where the community's surplus was gathered and redistributed. They were places where offerings were made to the powers that governed the flood and the harvest. And they were places where the first steps toward record-keeping were being taken, where someone, at some point, looked at the problem of tracking large quantities of goods moving in and out of a central store and began to think about how to represent that information in a durable, portable, and unambiguous form. The solution they arrived at was clay. Clay was everywhere in Mesopotamia. The same alluvial silt that made the fields fertile could be scooped up from any riverbank, kneaded into a smooth mass, and shaped into a tablet small enough to hold in one hand. A stylus cut from a reed, those same reeds that filled the river margins, could be pressed into the surface of the wet clay to make marks, and when the clay dried, those marks were permanent. If you wanted to be really sure they would last, you could fire the tablet in a kiln, turning it from soft clay into something approaching ceramic. Hard, durable, resistant to water and time. The earliest writing on such tablets, dating to around 3300 BCE at the city of Uruk, was not literature. It was not poetry or history or myth. It was accounting. Lists of commodities, numbers of sheep and jars of oil and measures of grain, the names of workers and the rations they received. These early tablets are, in a sense, deeply mundane, the administrative paperwork of a large and complex institution, but they represent one of the most significant cognitive leaps in human history. For the first time, information could exist outside of a human mind. For the first time, a record could outlast the person who made it. And once that was possible, the implications were enormous. If you could record a list of sheep, you could also record a list of kings. If you could record a list of kings, you could record how long each one reigned. If you could record how long each one reigned, you could begin to construct a timeline, a sequence of human events stretching back into the past, anchored not in living memory, but in durable clay. You could, in other words, begin to write history. The people of ancient Sumer understood this, and they used it. Over the centuries following the invention of writing, the scribal tradition in Mesopotamia grew and deepened. The simple pictographic signs of the earliest tablets evolved into the more abstract wedge-shaped marks that we call cuneiform, a word derived from the Latin for wedge. These marks could represent not just objects and numbers, but sounds, syllables, whole words and concepts. With cuneiform, you could write not just lists, but sentences. Not just sentences, but paragraphs. Not just paragraphs, but stories, hymns, laments, astronomical observations, legal codes, medical prescriptions, and cosmological myths. And among those cosmological myths, preserved in the great temple libraries and scribble schools of cities like Nippur and Eridu and Ur, there were the stories of what had come before, the long ages of the world before the flood, the cities that had stood in that earlier time, the kings who had ruled them, and the catastrophe that had ended it all and made the present world possible. Those stories, pressed into clay by careful hands in the lamplight of ancient schoolrooms, are what we have come to call the record of the end of the sixth civilization before ours. And to understand them fully, we must first understand the world that created them, the world of the Sumerian scribes who sat at their low writing desks in the heat of the Mesopotamian summer, pressing their reed styluses into fresh clay and tried to remember everything. As the dry season settled over the southern plain, turning the fields to pale gold and the river margins to cracked mud, those scribes continued their work, one careful mark at a time, building from nothing the most enduring archive the ancient world would ever know. Years passed, then centuries, and the tradition they began would eventually produce a document so strange, so quietly astonishing, that when modern scholars first encountered it in the ruins of Nineveh, they did not quite know what to make of it. But that moment of rediscovery lay far in the future. For now, the clay was still wet and the stylus was still moving, and the world that would be recorded on those tablets was only just beginning to take the shape it would carry into history. The seasons turned again over the flat plain between the two rivers, and in the early morning light before the heat of the day made work difficult, a farmer walking to his field might have paused at the edge of the irrigation channel and looked out over the land that stretched to every horizon, flat and enormous and breathing with the slow pulse of cultivation, and felt, perhaps without being able to name it, the weight of all the time that had passed and all the time still to come, pressing gently down on the present moment like the warm hand of something very old and very patient. And somewhere not far away, in the cool interior of a mud brick building that smelled of damp clay and lamp oil and the faint sweetness of date wine, a young scribe was pressing a reed into a tablet and learning, for the first time, the signs that would allow him to write the name of a city that had existed before the flood. The city that young scribe was learning to write had a name that meant, in the oldest layers of the Sumerian language, something close to the good place, or the fertile ground. It was called Eridu, and according to the traditions preserved in the temple libraries of ancient Mesopotamia, it was the first city that had ever existed. Not just the first city of the present age, but the first city of all time, the place where kingship had originally descended from heaven and taken up residence among human beings in the very beginning of the world. Eridu sits today as a low mound of sand and crumbled mud brick in the southern Iraqi desert, not far from the city of Nasiriyah. The wind moves across it without obstruction, carrying fine dust from one side of the mound to the other, and in the full heat of summer, the air above it shimmers and distorts, making the ruins seem to float slightly above the ground as if they have not entirely decided to belong to the earth. Archaeologists who excavated the site in the 20th century found, beneath layer after layer of occupation debris, a sequence of temple structures going back to approximately 5400 BCE, making Eridu one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in the world and one of the oldest places where a building that might reasonably be called a temple has been found. Those earliest temples at Eridu were small. The oldest was a single room, perhaps 3 meters on a side, with an altar niche in one wall and traces of ash and burnt bone on the floor that suggest offerings were made there. Above it, in later centuries, other temples were built on the same spot, each one slightly larger and more elaborate than the last, as if the people of Eridu understood that the sanctity of the place accumulated with each generation and demanded ever greater expression. By the time the site was at its most active, around 3000 BCE, the temple complex had grown into a substantial structure raised on a mud brick platform, a modest ancestor of the great ziggurats that would later define the cities of Babylon and Ur. But what matters for our story tonight is not the physical structure of the temples at Eridu, remarkable as they are. What matters is what the people who built and used those temples believed about the place. Because in the Sumerian cosmological tradition, Eridu was not merely old, it was primordial, it was the beginning, and the god who presided over it, the god whose house the temple was Enki, the lord of the deep fresh water, the master of wisdom and craft and the arts of civilization. Enki was one of the most important figures in the Sumerian pantheon, and his character is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it illuminates something essential about how the ancient Mesopotamians understood the relationship between knowledge, power, and the preservation of civilization. Enki was not a god of war or conquest. He was not a god of the sky or the storm, though those deities had their own important roles in the Sumerian divine order. Enki was a god of intelligence, of craft, of the subtle and practical arts that make human life possible. Irrigation, metalworking, the scribal arts, the knowledge of plants and their uses. He was said to dwell in the Abzu, the great freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, feeding the springs and rivers that made the land fertile. And he was said to be the keeper of the Mi, a Sumerian word that scholars translate variously as divine powers or civilizational attributes, the fundamental principles that governed all aspects of ordered human life. The Mi included things like kingship and priesthood, truth and descent into the underworld, the scribal arts and music and the crafts of the smith. They were conceived as real, concrete objects, tablets or rods that could be held, stolen, given as gifts, or lost. And in the mythological tradition, it was Enki who held most of them, who guarded them in his underwater dwelling, and who was responsible for their proper distribution among gods and humans. The idea that civilization itself could be embodied in a set of objects, that the arts and institutions of human life had a kind of divine reality that could be preserved or destroyed, is one of the most distinctive features of Sumerian thought, and it connects directly to the tradition of the tablet that records the end of the world before. Because if civilization could be embodied in the Mi, if the arts of writing and governance and craftsmanship had a divine, portable reality, then it followed that civilization could also be saved. It could be gathered up before the catastrophe, carried through the flood in the hull of a boat, and set down again on the other side of the disaster, ready to begin again. This is precisely what certain Sumerian and Babylonian texts describe, and the figure who performs this act of preservation is one of the most important in the entire tradition. The man who would later be known by many names in many cultures, but who in the oldest Sumerian texts is called Ziusudra. Ziusudra was, according to the tradition, the last king of the antediluvian world, the final ruler in the long sequence of kings who had reigned before the flood. He was a man of exceptional piety, devoted to the gods and attentive to the signs they sent, and it was to Ziusudra that Enki came, in a dream or through the wall of a reed house, to deliver the warning that would save not just one man's life, but the continuity of civilization itself. The flood was coming. Everything would be swept away. But if Ziusudra built a great boat and filled it with the seeds of life and the records of what had been, then something would survive. The thread would not be entirely cut. The knowledge would not be entirely lost. This story, the great flood narrative, the survivor, the boat, the preservation of life and knowledge through catastrophe, is one of the oldest and most widely distributed stories in human culture. It appears, in various forms, in traditions from Mesopotamia to the Indian subcontinent to the Pacific Islands to the Americas, and its widespread presence has fascinated scholars, theologians, and ordinary readers for as long as the ancient texts have been available to read. We will return to the question of what lies behind this universal story, whether it reflects a real historical catastrophe, a shared psychological archetype, or some combination of the two, later in our journey tonight. For now, what matters is the specific form the story took in ancient Sumer, and what it tells us about how the Sumerians understood their own place in history. The text known as the Eridu Genesis, preserved on a fragmentary tablet that was excavated at Nippur and is now held in the collection of the University Museum in Philadelphia, is one of our oldest sources for the Sumerian flood tradition. The tablet itself dates to around 1600 BCE, but the tradition it records is almost certainly much older. Scholars believe it draws on oral and written sources going back to the early 3rd millennium BCE or beyond. The text is damaged, with significant portions missing, but what survives is remarkable. It begins with the creation of human beings and the establishment of the first cities, including Eridu. It describes the institution of kingship as a gift from the gods, and then it turns to the flood. The surviving portion of the Eridu Genesis describes how the gods decided to send the flood to destroy humanity. The reasons given in the text are not entirely clear from the damaged passage, but other Mesopotamian sources suggest that the noise and overpopulation of humanity had disturbed the sleep of the gods, or that humanity had somehow failed in its obligations to the divine order. Whatever the reason, the decision was made and the flood was coming. But Enki, who was sympathetic to humanity and unwilling to see everything destroyed, found a way to warn Ziusudra without directly violating the divine decree. He spoke through the wall of a reed house, so that technically he was not addressing Ziusudra directly, a piece of divine legalism that has charmed scholars for generations, and Ziusudra, understanding the message, built his boat and survived. The Eridu Genesis, as we have it, breaks off before the end of the flood narrative, but other texts fill in the gaps. After the waters receded, Ziusudra emerged from his boat and made offerings to the gods. He was granted eternal life and taken to dwell in the land of Dilmun, a paradise located in the Sumerian geographical imagination, somewhere to the east or southeast, perhaps in the region of the Persian Gulf. And the world began again. Now, the document that sits at the heart of tonight's story, the text that most explicitly records the existence of a civilization, or rather a sequence of civilizations before the flood, is not the Eridu Genesis, but the Sumerian King List. This is a document of a rather different character, where the Eridu Genesis is a mythological narrative with gods and heroes and dramatic events. The Sumerian King List is something much more austere. It is a list, a formal bureaucratic enumeration of kings, their cities, and the lengths of their reigns, organised in a strict sequence from the very beginning of kingship to the compiler's own time. The King List exists in multiple versions, found at various sites across Mesopotamia, and the different versions agree in their broad outlines while differing in some details. The most complete single version is a clay prism known as the Weld-Blundell prism, which was purchased by an Oxford collector named Herbert Weld-Blundell in the early 20th century and is now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It dates to approximately 1800 BCE and contains a remarkably complete version of the list, written in 4 columns of neat, cuneiform script running around all 4 sides of the prism. The prism is a beautiful object in its own right, a column of baked clay about 20 centimeters tall, tapering slightly toward the top, covered from base to apex in rows of tiny wedge-shaped marks. If you hold it in your hands, and scholars have, you feel the weight of it, the solidity of it, the almost aggressive permanence of the baked clay. It was made to last. It was made to be a record that would not fade or rot or be forgotten, and in a sense it succeeded. More than 3,000 years after it was made, it still carries its message intact. The message begins with a phrase that has become one of the most famous openings in ancient literature. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, and then the list begins. The first king of Eridu was a man whose name is given as Alulim, and he is said to have reigned for 2800 years. The second king of Eridu, Alalngar, reigned for 36,000 years. Then kingship moved to another city, Bad Tibira, and the kings there reigned for similarly enormous spans. One of them, a figure named Dumuzi, is credited with a reign of 36,000 years. The list continues through 5 cities and 8 kings, though some versions give slightly different numbers, before arriving at a single line that divides the entire document in 2. Then the flood swept over. Those 4 words, in the original Sumerian, a brief and almost casual phrase, represent the boundary between 2 worlds. Everything before them belongs to what the ancient Mesopotamians understood as the antediluvian age, the time before the flood. Everything after them belongs to the world that followed, the world of historical kings and documented cities, the world that gradually shades from myth into something approaching verifiable history. The reigns of the antediluvian kings are, of course, impossible in any literal sense. No human being has ever lived for 2800 years, let alone reigned as a king for that length of time. Scholars have proposed various explanations for these numbers, that they represent astronomical cycles, that they encode some kind of mathematical or calendrical system, that they are symbolic expressions of the idea that the ancient kings were closer to the gods, and therefore partook of a divine longevity that later, more fully human rulers did not share. Some scholars have suggested that the numbers might reflect a misunderstanding of an earlier system of notation, in which what was originally recorded as months was later read as years. Others have proposed that the enormous reigns are simply a literary device for expressing the idea that the antediluvian world was qualitatively different from the present one. older, more powerful, more directly connected to the divine. Whatever the explanation, the effect is striking. The antediluvian kings, with their tens of thousands of years of reign, create a sense of almost geological time. A deep past so remote that it lies beyond the reach of ordinary human imagination. And that, perhaps, is precisely the point. The world before the flood was not just older than the present world, it was different in kind. It belonged to a different order of time, a different mode of existence that the flood had permanently ended. The cities named in the antediluvian portion of the king list are 5: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. These are not invented names. They are real cities, all of them attested in the archaeological and historical record, all of them located in the southern Mesopotamian plain. Eridu we have already encountered. Shuruppak, modern Tel Fera, is particularly interesting because it is the city from which the flood hero originates in the later Babylonian version of the flood story. The fact that real, excavatable cities are named as the seats of the antediluvian kings is one of the features of the king list that has most intrigued scholars. It suggests that the tradition is not purely fantastical, that it is anchored, however loosely, in some memory of actual places and perhaps actual events. And here we arrive at one of the most fascinating and contested questions in the study of ancient Mesopotamia. What, if anything, lies behind the tradition of the antediluvian world? Is there any historical or geological reality that corresponds to the memory of a civilization swept away by a great flood? Or is the flood purely mythological, a narrative device for explaining the transition from the divine age to the human age, with no basis in actual events? The question is not simple, and the answers that scholars have proposed are varied and sometimes contradictory. But before we can examine them properly, we need to understand more fully the world in which the king list was compiled and used. The world of the Sumerian scribes and their remarkable civilization, which was itself, in a sense, a second beginning after the flood that the myths described. The scribal schools of ancient Sumer were called Aduba, a word that means something like tablet house, and they were among the most important institutions in Mesopotamian society. They were places where the sons, and occasionally daughters, of the elite came to learn the art of cuneiform writing, which was a demanding and time-consuming skill that required years of practice to master. The curriculum of the Aduba has been partially reconstructed from the practice tablets and school texts that have survived, and it gives a vivid picture of what it meant to be educated in ancient Mesopotamia. A student entering the Aduba would begin with the most basic exercises, learning to hold the stylus correctly, learning to press it into the clay at the right angle to produce clean, consistent wedge marks, learning the simplest signs before moving on to more complex ones. The clay tablets used for practice were often recycled. A student would write on a tablet, show it to the teacher, then smooth the surface and write again. Only the best work, or the most important texts, were dried and preserved. The rest were returned to the clay pile to be used again. The school day was long. Students arrived early, before the heat of the day made the clay dry too quickly, and they worked through the morning hours in a room lit by small clay oil lamps that cast a warm, slightly smoky light over the rows of students bent over their tablets. The smell of the room was distinctive. Damp clay, lamp oil, the sweat of concentrated effort, and perhaps the faint sweetness of the date wine that was sometimes offered as refreshment. The teacher, called the school father, moved among the students, correcting their work, demonstrating the proper form of a difficult sign, occasionally delivering punishment to those who were inattentive or careless. As students progressed through the curriculum, they moved from basic sign lists to more complex exercises, copying standard administrative formulas, then literary texts, then the great works of Sumerian literature that formed the core of the scribal tradition. These included hymns to the gods, laments for destroyed cities, wisdom literature in the form of proverbs and dialogues, and the great mythological narratives, the stories of Inanna and Dumuzi, the exploits of the hero Gilgamesh, the creation of humanity, and the flood. A fully trained scribe would have these texts memorized as well as written. The oral and written traditions reinforced each other, each serving as a check on the accuracy of the other. The importance of this dual tradition, oral and written, memory and clay, cannot be overstated. It meant that the knowledge preserved in the scribal schools was not merely stored but actively maintained, kept alive in the minds and voices of trained practitioners who could reproduce it even if the physical tablets were lost, and tablets were lost regularly. The mud brick buildings that housed the libraries and schools were vulnerable to fire, flood, and the slow dissolution of time. The tablets themselves, unless fired, could be damaged by moisture. Collections were scattered when cities were destroyed. But as long as trained scribes survived, the tradition survived with them, ready to be written down again on fresh clay. This resilience of the scribal tradition helps explain one of the most striking features of Mesopotamian literature, its extraordinary conservatism. Texts that were first composed in the early 3rd millennium BCE were still being copied, with relatively minor changes, in the 1st millennium BCE, a span of 2,000 years during which the political landscape of Mesopotamia changed almost beyond recognition, with Sumerians giving way to Akkadians, Akkadians to Babylonians, Babylonians to Assyrians and then to Persians, and yet the core literary tradition remained remarkably stable. The scribes who copied the Sumerian king list in 1800 BCE were preserving a tradition that was already, by their time, very old, and the scribes who copied it again in later centuries were doing the same. This is the context in which the idea of the antediluvian civilizations must be understood. It was not a casual invention or a piece of entertaining fiction. It was a carefully preserved element of a formal tradition, transmitted through institutions dedicated to the maintenance of knowledge and treated with the same respect and seriousness as the most sacred religious texts. When the scribes wrote down the names of the antediluvian kings and their impossible reigns, they were not making things up. They were recording what the tradition said, faithfully and completely, because that was their job and their vocation, and their deepest obligation to the civilization that had produced them. And what the tradition said was this: before the flood there had been cities, there had been kings, there had been civilization, in the full Sumerian sense of the word, organized communities, divine kingship, the arts and crafts of civilized life. That civilization had lasted for a very long time. Longer, the numbers suggested, than the human mind could easily compass. And then it had ended, not through any failure of its own, but through a divine decision that was beyond human control or comprehension. The flood came, and the world that had been was gone. After the flood, the text said, kingship descended from heaven again, a new beginning, a fresh start on the same land with the same rivers, the same soil, the same sky. But a different world nonetheless, a world in which the reigns of kings were measured in centuries rather than millennia, in which the direct connection to the divine that had characterized the antediluvian age had been attenuated, in which human beings were more fully and irreversibly mortal than they had been before. The scribes who recorded this tradition were, in a sense, the inheritors of both worlds. They lived in the post-flood world, the world of measurable history and finite human lives. But through their work, through the careful maintenance of the texts that described what had come before, they kept the memory of the antediluvian world alive. They were the bridge between the time before and the time after. And the tablets they pressed their marks into were the medium of that bridging, small, durable, patient objects that carried the weight of the world's memory from one generation to the next. As the afternoon heat settled over the scribble school, and the clay on the practice tablets began to dry at the edges, and the oil in the lamps burned low, a student might have paused in his copying and looked at the signs he had just made. The name of a city that had stood before the flood, the number of years a king had reigned in that city, and felt perhaps the same quiet vertigo that we feel when we read those same signs today. The sense of looking down into a very deep well and seeing, far below, the faint glimmer of something that was once a world. The seasons turned over Nippur and Eridu and Ur, and the scribes kept writing, and the clay kept its record, and the tradition moved forward through time like a slow river carrying its freight of memory toward a shore that no one could yet see. The development of cuneiform writing was not a single event, but a long, slow unfolding, like the growth of a tree from a seed so small that the eye can barely find it. The earliest marks pressed into clay at Uruk around 3300 BCE were simple pictures: a head, a hand, a fish, a jar. They were mnemonic devices more than a true writing system, prompts that helped a trained administrator recall information that he already held in his mind. But over the centuries that followed, something remarkable happened to those simple pictures. They became abstract. They were rotated 90 degrees from their original orientation, so that a sign that had once looked like a head now looked like a cluster of wedges pointing in various directions. They were combined in new ways to express sounds rather than objects, and gradually, through a process that must have involved countless small innovations by countless unnamed scribes working in the schools and temples of the southern plain, they became capable of expressing the full range of human thought and feeling. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, cuneiform had developed to the point where it could record not just lists and administrative formulas, but complex literary texts, hymns of praise to the gods, laments over the destruction of cities, wisdom literature, and the great mythological narratives that formed the core of Sumerian religious and cultural life. The scribes who worked with this mature cuneiform system were not merely clerks or accountants, though many of them spent much of their working lives on exactly that kind of practical record-keeping. They were also the custodians of a literary tradition of extraordinary richness and depth, and the best of them understood their work in those terms, as a sacred responsibility to preserve and transmit the accumulated wisdom of their civilization. The city of Nippur, located roughly in the center of the Mesopotamian plain, was the great intellectual and religious center of ancient Sumer. It was the city of Enlil, the chief of the Sumerian gods, and its temple complex, the Ekka, or mountain house, was the most sacred site in the Sumerian world. But Nippur was also a city of scribes and scholars, and the excavations carried out there by American archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries produced one of the largest and most important collections of cuneiform tablets ever found. Tens of thousands of tablets were recovered from the ruins of Nippur, covering a vast range of subjects: administrative records, legal documents, letters, school texts, and literary compositions of every kind. Among the literary texts from Nippur were multiple copies of the Sumerian king list and fragments of the Eridu Genesis, as well as portions of other texts that touched on the antediluvian tradition. The abundance of these copies tells us something important. This was not obscure or marginal material. It was central to the scribal curriculum, copied and recopied by generations of students as part of their standard training. Every educated person in ancient Sumer would have been familiar with the tradition of the antediluvian kings and the flood that ended their world. It was as fundamental to their understanding of history and cosmology as the creation narrative is to the traditions of the Abrahamic religions. The scribal school at Nippur, like those in other Sumerian cities, was organized around a hierarchy of teachers and students that reflected the broader social hierarchy of Mesopotamian society. At the top was the head teacher, sometimes called the school father, who was responsible for the overall curriculum and the maintenance of the school's tablet collection. Below him were assistant teachers who specialized in particular areas: mathematics, Sumerian literary language, the Amesal dialect used in certain religious texts, the Akkadian language that was increasingly important as the political landscape of Mesopotamia shifted. And at the bottom were the students themselves, arranged roughly by age and level of advancement, working their way through a curriculum that might take a decade or more to complete. The daily life of a student scribe was demanding, and, by modern standards, quite austere. He rose early, before dawn in the summer months, to take advantage of the cooler morning hours. He ate a simple breakfast, perhaps bread made from barley flour, a few dates, a small amount of beer, which was safer to drink than the river water and provided some nourishment. Then he walked to the school, carrying his writing tools, a bundle of reed styluses, perhaps a small pot of water for dampening the clay, and a leather bag for carrying the tablets he would work on that day. The school building itself was a modest mud brick structure, its thick walls keeping the interior relatively cool even on the hottest days. The floor was beaten earth, covered in places with woven reed mats. The light came from small windows set high in the walls and from clay oil lamps that burned sesame oil or rendered animal fat, casting a warm yellow light that was adequate for close work, but that must have strained the eyes over the course of a long day. The smell of the room was the smell of the scribble world: damp clay, lamp oil, the dry dusty scent of old tablets stacked in their storage jars along the walls. Students sat on low benches or on the floor itself, their tablets resting on their knees or on low wooden boards. The act of writing cuneiform was a physical skill that required considerable practice to master. The stylus was held between the thumb and first two fingers, with the triangular tip pressed into the clay at a specific angle to produce the characteristic wedge shape of the signs. The pressure had to be consistent. Too light, and the marks would be faint and unclear. Too heavy, and the stylus would gouge the clay unevenly. The wrist had to be kept steady while the fingers moved, and the whole hand had to be positioned correctly relative to the tablet surface. A student who had not yet developed the proper technique would produce signs that were irregular, cramped, or poorly formed, and the teacher would correct him with patient repetition, or, if patience ran out, with the switch that hung on the wall near the teacher's seat. But for a student who had mastered the technique, there was something deeply satisfying about the work. The signs emerged cleanly from the clay, each one a small, precise geometric construction of wedges and angles, building up line by line into a text that could be read and understood by any trained scribe anywhere in the Mesopotamian world. There was a craft pride in it, an artisanal satisfaction in the quality of the marks that must have been part of what kept students working through the long school days and the demanding curriculum. The texts they copied included, at the more advanced levels, the great literary compositions of the Sumerian tradition. Among these was the composition that scholars call the Sumerian King List, and a student copying it for the first time would have encountered in the opening lines a cosmological statement of remarkable scope and confidence. Kingship, the text declared, had descended from heaven. It had been placed first in Eridu, the oldest city, the city of Enki and wisdom, and then the names began, Alulim, Alalngar and the rest, with their impossible reigns stretching back into a time so remote that the numbers themselves seemed to belong to a different order of reality. A thoughtful student might have paused over those numbers, his stylus hovering above the clay, and wondered, what did it mean that a king had reigned for 2800 years? The student knew from his own experience and from everything he had been taught that human lives were measured in decades, not millennia. The oldest person he had ever known might have lived to 60 or 70 years, and such a person was considered ancient, their body worn and their memory stretching back to events that younger people had only heard described. What kind of world was it in which a king could reign for hundreds of centuries? What kind of people had lived in that world? What had their cities looked like, their temples, their markets, their homes? The text did not say, at least not in any detail. The king list was not a narrative, it was a list, and it gave only the barest information about each antediluvian king, his name, his city, and the length of his reign. Other texts filled in a little more. The Eridu Genesis gave some sense of the creation of the first cities and the institution of kingship, and certain hymns and mythological compositions referred in passing to the antediluvian world as a time of particular divine favour, when the gods and humans were closer together than they would ever be again. But for the most part, the world before the flood was left as a kind of vast dark background, present in the tradition, acknowledged in the texts, but not illuminated in any detail. This reticence is itself significant. The scribes who preserved and transmitted these traditions were not inventing a detailed mythology of the antediluvian world. They were recording what the tradition said, and the tradition said relatively little about the specifics of that earlier time. It said that there had been cities, that there had been kings, that civilization had existed. It said that the flood had come and ended it all, and it said that afterward, kingship had descended from heaven again, and civilization had begun anew. The details of what that earlier civilization had actually been like, its culture, its technology, its daily life, its achievements, were not preserved, or perhaps had never been part of the tradition in the first place. And this raises a fascinating question that scholars have debated for generations. Why? If the antediluvian tradition was important enough to be preserved in the formal scribal curriculum, copied and recopied for centuries, why was it not elaborated in more detail? Why did the scribes not write more about what life had been like before the flood, what the antediluvian cities had looked like, what their people had known and built and believed? One answer is that the tradition was simply too old and too fragmentary by the time it reached the scribal schools. Whatever memories or knowledge had once existed about the period before the flood had been reduced, through centuries of oral transmission and the inevitable losses of time, to the bare skeleton that the texts preserve. The names, the cities, the numbers, the fact of the flood. These were the elements that had survived the long journey through oral tradition to the moment of writing. The rest had been lost. Another answer, which is not incompatible with the first, is that the antediluvian world was deliberately kept vague and mysterious because its vagueness served an important function. A world described in detail can be questioned, challenged, compared to known reality and found wanting. a world described only in outline is more resistant to such challenges. It exists in a different register from the world of daily experience, in the realm of the mythological and the cosmological, rather than the historical and the verifiable. By leaving the antediluvian world largely undescribed, the tradition preserved its sacred character, its quality as something fundamentally different from and prior to the present order. There is a third possibility too, one that is more speculative but worth considering. Perhaps the scribes who compiled and transmitted the king list and the related texts were themselves uncertain about the nature of the antediluvian world. Perhaps they, like us, were working from fragmentary and imperfectly understood sources, doing their best to preserve what they had received while acknowledging, at least implicitly, that much had been lost. The flat, bureaucratic tone of the king list, the same tone used to list post-flood kings whose historical existence is well attested, may reflect not confident mythological assertion, but careful scholarly caution. Here is what the tradition says, recorded as faithfully as possible, without embellishment or interpretation. This possibility becomes more interesting when we consider that the Sumerian scribal tradition was, in many ways, a tradition of scholarship as well as record-keeping. The scribes were not merely copyists. They were scholars who compared different versions of texts, noted variant readings, composed commentaries and explanatory notes, and engaged in what we might recognize as a form of textual criticism. Some of the tablets from Nippur and other sites include marginal notes, in which a scribe has recorded that a particular sign or passage was unclear in the source he was copying from, or that he has followed one tradition rather than another where the texts disagreed. These scholars cared about accuracy, they cared about getting the record right, and when they wrote down the names of the antediluvian kings and their impossible reigns, they were doing so in that same spirit of careful, faithful transmission, preserving what they had received, even if they could not fully explain it. The tradition they were preserving had, by the time of the earliest written versions we possess, already been shaped and reshaped by centuries of oral transmission. The Sumerian king list in its written form dates to approximately 2100 BCE at the earliest, but the tradition it records is certainly older. How much older is impossible to say with certainty, though some scholars believe that elements of it may go back to the early 3rd millennium BCE, or even earlier. By the time the first scribe sat down to press those names and numbers into clay, he was already working at a significant remove from whatever original tradition he was recording. He was, in a sense, doing what we are doing tonight, reaching back across a vast distance of time, trying to recover something that was already ancient, already partially lost, already filtered through layers of memory and interpretation that he could not entirely see through. The Akkadian tradition, which developed alongside and eventually largely replaced the Sumerian in the political and cultural life of Mesopotamia, preserved and elaborated the flood narrative in ways that are both similar to and different from the Sumerian sources. The most important Akkadian version of the flood story is found in the Epic of Atrahasis, a composition that dates in its written form to around 1700 BCE, but that, like the Sumerian texts, almost certainly draws on much older oral traditions. Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, is the Akkadian counterpart of Ziusudra, the righteous man who survives the flood through divine warning and careful preparation. The Atrahasis epic is a more elaborate narrative than anything in the Sumerian flood tradition. It begins with the creation of humanity. Human beings were created, the text explains, to do the work that the lesser gods had previously been required to perform, the labour of digging irrigation channels and maintaining the fields. But humanity multiplied rapidly, and their noise disturbed the sleep of Enlil, the chief of the gods. Enlil tried several times to reduce the human population through plague and drought and famine, but each time Enki found a way to warn Atrahasis and help humanity survive. Finally, Enlil decided on the flood, a total destruction that would end the problem of humanity once and for all. And Enki, unwilling to see his creation destroyed, warned Atrahasis through the wall of a reed house and instructed him to build his boat. The details of the boat in the Atrahasis epic are sparse, but the text makes clear that Atrahasis loaded it with animals and with members of his family, and that he sealed it against the rising waters with bitumen, the natural tar that seeped from the ground in certain parts of Mesopotamia, and was used for waterproofing everything from boats to baskets. The flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights, the text says, and when it was over, Atrahasis opened a window and saw that the land had returned. He made offerings to the gods, and the gods, smelling the sweet smoke of the sacrifice and realizing how much they had missed humanity's worship, agreed that the flood would not happen again. The Epic of Atrahasis is important for our story, not just because it preserves the flood narrative, but because it frames that narrative within a larger cosmological context, the story of the creation of humanity and its troubled relationship with the divine. The flood in this telling is not an arbitrary act of divine caprice, but the culmination of a long series of divine attempts to manage the problem of a humanity that had grown too numerous and too noisy. And the survival of Atrahasis is not just a personal salvation, but a reset, a new beginning for humanity under new conditions, with a divine promise that total destruction would not happen again. This framing gives the antediluvian world a specific character in the Akkadian tradition. It was a world of abundance and multiplication, a world that had grown so full of human life and human noise that it had become, in some sense, too much for the gods to bear, too much for the divine order to sustain. The flood was a pruning, a reduction, a return to a more manageable scale. And the post-flood world was a world that had learned, through catastrophe, the importance of limits. The greatest of all the Mesopotamian literary compositions, the Epic of Gilgamesh, also engages with the flood tradition, and does so in a way that connects the antediluvian world directly to the question that drives the entire epic, the question of mortality. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a being of extraordinary power and vitality who nonetheless must face, like all human beings, the fact of death. After the death of his beloved companion Enkidu, Gilgamesh is consumed by grief and terror, and he sets out on a journey to find Utnapishtim, the Babylonian counterpart of Ziusudra and Atrahasis, who alone among all human beings has been granted immortality by the gods. Utnapishtim lives at the ends of the earth, beyond the waters of death, in a paradise that is clearly related to the Sumerian concept of Dilmun. When Gilgamesh finally reaches him and asks how he came to be immortal, Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood. He was the one who survived. He was the one who was warned by Ea, the Babylonian name for Enki, and built the great boat and filled it with the seed of all living things. And after the flood, the gods granted him eternal life as a reward for his service to the continuity of creation. The flood story as told by Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh is the most detailed and elaborate version we have from ancient Mesopotamia. It includes specific dimensions for the boat, a perfect cube, each side measuring 60 cubits, and describes the loading of the boat with craftsmen, animals, and the seeds of all plants. It describes the onset of the flood in vivid terms, the sky going dark, the storm gods driving the rain, the sea rising until even the gods were terrified and retreated to the highest heaven. It describes the silence after the flood, when the waters lay flat and still over the drowned world, and the boat rested on the peak of a mountain. And it describes Utnapishtim releasing birds, first a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, to test whether the land had dried. This last detail, the release of birds to test the receding of the waters, is one of the most famous parallels between the Mesopotamian flood tradition and the biblical account of Noah, and it is worth pausing over for a moment. The similarities between the Gilgamesh flood narrative and the Genesis flood narrative are extensive and unmistakable. The divine decision to destroy humanity, the warning to a righteous man, the construction of a great boat, the loading of animals, the flood itself, the resting of the boat on a mountain, the release of birds, the offering of sacrifice after the waters recede, and the divine promise not to repeat the destruction. These parallels are not coincidental. They reflect a direct relationship between the Mesopotamian and biblical traditions, mediated through the long cultural contact between Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East. The relationship between these traditions is a subject of enormous scholarly interest and considerable public fascination, and we will return to it in more detail as our story continues. For now, what matters is the simple fact of the parallels themselves and what they tell us about the reach and influence of the Mesopotamian flood tradition. This was not a story that stayed in one place. It travelled. It was adapted and retold by different cultures in different languages, each one shaping it to fit their own cosmological and theological frameworks, but all of them preserving the essential core. There was a world before, the flood came, and a new world began after. The question of what that earlier world was, the world before the flood, the world of the antediluvian kings with their impossible reigns, is one that the ancient texts raise but do not fully answer. The scribes who preserved the tradition knew that something had been lost, that the world they lived in was a second world, a rebuilt world, a world that stood on the ruins of something older and in some ways greater. They preserved that knowledge in their careful lists and their mythological narratives, and they passed it forward through the centuries in the only medium they had, clay. And as the clay dried in the afternoon sun, and the marks pressed into it hardened into permanence, the tradition they were preserving moved quietly forward through time, waiting for the moment, still thousands of years in the future, when it would be dug from the ground again and read by eyes that had never expected to find it. The lamps burned low in the scribble school at Nipper, and the students packed away their tablets, and the school father checked the day's work one last time before the building was closed for the night. Outside, the stars were coming out over the flat plain, the same stars that had watched over the antediluvian cities, the same stars that had reflected in the waters of the flood, the same stars that would continue to wheel overhead long after the last cuneiform scribe had pressed his last mark into his last piece of clay. A generation passed, then another, and the tradition kept moving, one careful tablet at a time. The city of Nippur stood at the centre of the Mesopotamian world in more than just a geographical sense. It was the place where the divine order of the universe was understood to be most fully present, where the decisions of the gods filtered down into the human realm most clearly, and where the records of those decisions were kept with the greatest care. The Eka Temple, home of Enlil, rose above the surrounding plain on its massive mud brick platform, its walls catching the first light of dawn and the last light of evening, visible from a considerable distance across the flat landscape. Priests moved through its courtyards in the early morning, performing the rituals that kept the divine machinery of the cosmos turning. The washing and dressing of the god statue, the presentation of the morning meal, the burning of incense whose smoke rose in thin blue columns into the brightening sky. But the life of Nippur was not confined to its temples, important as those were. The city was also a place of markets and workshops, of families and neighbourhoods, of the ordinary textures of daily existence that are so easy to overlook when we focus on the grand narratives of history and religion. A visitor arriving at Nippur in the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, at the height of Sumerian civilization, would have found a city of considerable size and complexity. Its streets laid out in the irregular pattern of organic growth rather than deliberate planning. Its buildings packed closely together to take advantage of every square metre of the raised ground that kept the city above the floodplain. The houses of ordinary Nippur residents were built of mud brick, the same material used for everything from the humblest storage shed to the grandest temple. Mud brick was not an inferior building material. It was, in the climate of Mesopotamia, an excellent one. The thick walls of a mud brick house absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, keeping the interior relatively cool in summer and warm in the cooler months. The flat roofs, accessible by an exterior staircase or a wooden ladder, served as sleeping platforms in the hot season, when the family would carry their reed mats up to the roof and sleep under the open sky, catching whatever breeze moved across the plain in the night hours. Inside, the typical house of a modestly prosperous family would have had several rooms arranged around a small central courtyard open to the sky. The courtyard was the heart of the house, the place where cooking was done, where children played, where the family's donkey or goat might be kept at night, and where the household's daily activities unfolded in the light that fell from above. The rooms opening off the courtyard served as sleeping quarters, storage spaces, and perhaps a workroom where the family's craft or trade was practiced. The walls were plastered with a mixture of clay and chopped straw, sometimes whitewashed or decorated with simple geometric patterns pressed into the plaster while it was still wet. The household's possessions were modest by later standards, but by no means sparse. There were clay vessels of every size and shape, large storage jars for grain and oil, medium-sized cooking pots blackened by fire, small cups and bowls for daily use. There were stone grinding tools for processing grain, bronze or copper tools for cutting and scraping, wooden furniture in the form of low tables and stools, and perhaps a simple bed frame strung with woven cord. There were textiles. Wool was the primary fibre of ancient Mesopotamia, and the women of a household would have spent a significant portion of their time spinning and weaving, producing the cloth that clothed the family and that might also be sold or traded for other necessities. Food in ancient Nippur was built around barley, the staple crop of Mesopotamia, which was more tolerant of the slightly saline soils of the southern plain than wheat, and could be relied upon to produce a harvest even in years when conditions were less than ideal. Barley was ground into flour for bread and also fermented into beer, which was consumed in large quantities by people of all ages and social levels. It was safer than the river water, more nutritious than plain water, and an important source of calories in a diet that was otherwise relatively lean. Alongside barley, the people of Nippur ate lentils and chickpeas, onions and garlic and leeks, dates and figs and pomegranates when they were in season, fish from the rivers and canals, and occasionally the meat of sheep or goats, though meat was a luxury for most families and appeared at the table mainly on festival occasions. The festivals themselves were important events in the life of the city, moments when the boundary between the divine and the human was felt to be thinner than usual, when the gods were particularly present, and the community's relationship with them was renewed and reaffirmed. The Sumerian religious calendar was crowded with festivals, some lasting a single day, others extending over several days or even weeks. And the preparations for them involved the entire city in a collective effort of cleaning and decorating and cooking and brewing that must have generated a particular kind of communal energy, a shared anticipation that lifted the ordinary rhythm of daily life into something more heightened and meaningful. The New Year festival, known in Sumerian as the Akitu, was the most important of all. It was celebrated in the spring, at the time of the barley harvest, and it involved a complex series of rituals spread over several days. The central event was the sacred marriage, a ritual union between the king, who represented the god Dumuzi, and a priestess who represented the goddess Inanna, enacted in the innermost sanctuary of the temple. This union was understood to ensure the fertility of the land for the coming year, to renew the divine sanction for the king's rule, and to reaffirm the fundamental order of the cosmos. The city was decorated with greenery and flowers. The streets were swept and sprinkled with water, and the people gathered in the temple precincts to watch the processions and participate in the communal feasting that accompanied the sacred rituals. It was during festivals like the Akitu that the great literary compositions of the Sumerian tradition were performed, recited by trained singers and musicians in the temple courtyards, heard by the assembled population of the city, and thus kept alive in public memory as well as in the private collections of the scribal schools. The hymns to Inanna and Enlil, the laments for destroyed cities, the stories of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. These were not merely texts in a library. They were living performances, experienced collectively, felt in the body as well as understood by the mind. And among the traditions performed and recited in these public settings was, almost certainly, some version of the flood narrative, the story of the world before, the catastrophe, and the new beginning. It was a story that resonated deeply with the experience of people who lived in the floodplain of the Tigris and Euphrates, who knew from their own lifetimes and from the stories of their parents and grandparents how quickly and completely a flood could transform the landscape. The rivers of Mesopotamia flooded regularly, and while most years the flooding was manageable, a controlled inundation that spread fertile silt across the fields before receding, there were years when the floods were catastrophic, when the dikes broke and the canals overflowed and whole villages were submerged under meters of brown water. In those years, the flood myth was not merely a cosmological narrative, it was a living memory, a pattern that the present seemed to be repeating. The connection between the mythological flood and the real, recurring floods of Mesopotamian experience is one of the most important threads in the scholarly discussion of the antediluvian tradition. Archaeologists excavating at Ur in the 1920s, under the direction of Leonard Woolley, found a thick layer of clean, water-deposited silt beneath the ruins of the early dynastic city, a layer that Woolley initially interpreted as evidence of the biblical flood itself. He sent a telegram to his sponsors in London and New York that reportedly read simply, "We have found the flood." The discovery caused a sensation in the popular press, and for a time it seemed as if the mythological flood had been confirmed by the spade. Subsequent scholarship was more cautious. The flood deposit at Ur, while real and significant, was found to be a local event, a major but geographically limited inundation that had affected Ur but not other nearby sites. Similar flood deposits have been found at other Mesopotamian sites, but they date to different periods and represent different events, not a single catastrophic flood that covered the entire plain. The picture that emerged from these excavations was not of one great flood, but of many floods, a recurring pattern of inundation that punctuated the history of Mesopotamian settlement from the earliest periods to the historical era. This pattern of recurring floods is, in a sense, more interesting than a single catastrophic event would be. It suggests that the flood myth of ancient Mesopotamia was not the memory of one specific disaster, but a distillation of a long recurring experience. The experience of living in a landscape where the waters could rise and sweep everything away, where the work of years could be undone in days, where the line between habitable land and drowned plain was always provisional and always subject to revision by forces beyond human control. The antediluvian world in this reading is not a specific historical period, but a symbolic representation of everything that is lost when the flood comes, the accumulated work of generations, the familiar landmarks of daily life, the sense of permanence and continuity that human beings need to function and to hope. But there is another dimension to the question of what lies behind the flood tradition, one that operates on a much larger temporal scale than the annual or decadal flooding of the Mesopotamian rivers. This is the question of the great sea level rise that occurred at the end of the last ice age, roughly 10,000 to 6,000 years before the Common Era. As the vast ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere melted and poured their water into the world's oceans, the sea level rise was not uniform or steady. It proceeded in pulses, with periods of relative stability interrupted by rapid rises that could add meters to the ocean's depth in the span of a few centuries or even decades. In low-lying coastal regions and river deltas, these pulses of sea level rise could have been experienced as catastrophic floods, sudden, permanent inundations that drowned landscapes that had previously been dry land. The Persian Gulf, which lies at the southern end of the Mesopotamian plain, is particularly relevant in this context. Geological evidence suggests that at the peak of the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, the sea level was so much lower than it is today that the Persian Gulf was largely dry land, a broad, fertile river valley through which the Tigris, Euphrates and other rivers flowed toward a coastline far to the south of its current position. As the Ice Age ended and the sea level rose, this valley was gradually flooded, and the coastline moved northward, eventually reaching something close to its present position by around 6,000 years ago. This process of flooding, which took place over thousands of years, would have been experienced by the people living in the region as a slow but inexorable loss. The gradual submersion of familiar landscapes, the abandonment of settlements that had been inhabited for generations, the retreat of human communities northward and inland ahead of the rising waters. Whether this long process of environmental change left any direct trace in the flood traditions of ancient Mesopotamia is a matter of scholarly debate. The timescales are very different. The sea level rise was a process of millennia, not days or weeks, and the mechanisms by which the memory of such a slow change could be preserved in the form of a flood narrative are not obvious. Yet the possibility is intriguing, and it has been explored by a number of researchers who have proposed that the flood traditions of the ancient Near East may preserve, in distorted and mythologized form, some memory of the dramatic environmental changes of the post-glacial period. One of the most discussed hypotheses along these lines is the Black Sea hypothesis, proposed in the late 1990s by the geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman. They argued, based on geological and oceanographic evidence, that the Black Sea had been a freshwater lake during the last glacial period, isolated from the Mediterranean by a land barrier across what is now the Bosphorus Strait. As the Mediterranean sea level rose after the Ice Age, they proposed, the waters eventually overtopped and breached this barrier, sending a massive torrent of salt water into the freshwater lake and causing a catastrophic and rapid rise in the Black Sea's level, an event that would have flooded the shores of the lake and driven the people living there inland with great speed. Ryan and Pittman suggested that this event, which they dated to around 5600 BCE, might be the origin of the flood traditions that appear in Mesopotamian and biblical literature. The hypothesis attracted enormous popular attention and was the subject of several books and documentary films. It is a dramatic and appealing idea, a real, datable, geologically documented catastrophe that could have sent refugees spreading across the ancient Near East, carrying with them the memory of a world that had been drowned. Subsequent geological research has both supported and complicated the Black Sea hypothesis. There is good evidence for a major flooding event in the Black Sea region, though the scale, speed, and exact timing remain subjects of ongoing research and debate. Whether this event is connected to the Mesopotamian flood traditions is a question that cannot be definitively answered with the evidence currently available. The geographical distance between the Black Sea and Mesopotamia is considerable, and the cultural connections that would be required to transmit the memory of a Black Sea flood to the scribal schools of Nippur are not clearly established. What the Black Sea hypothesis and similar proposals remind us, however, is that the world of the ancient Near East in the millennia before the historical period was a world of dramatic environmental change, a world in which landscapes were being transformed, coastlines were shifting, rivers were changing their courses, and the climate was moving from the cold, dry conditions of the Ice Age toward the warmer, wetter conditions of the early Holocene. The people who lived through these changes and whose descendants eventually built the cities of ancient Sumer were not living in a stable and predictable environment. They were navigating a world in flux, and the stories they told about that world, including the story of the Great Flood, may reflect, however indirectly, the experience of living through transformations of a scale and speed that we, in our relatively stable Holocene climate, have difficulty imagining. The scribes of Nippur, copying the king list and the flood narratives in the comfortable stability of their well-established civilization, were separated from those ancient environmental upheavals by thousands of years. But they were preserving traditions that may have carried, in their deepest layers, the echo of those upheavals, the memory of a world that had been different, that had ended, and that had given way to the world they knew. When they wrote, "Then the flood swept over," they were writing a sentence that had been true in some form many times over the long history of human life in the Near East. They were writing the summary of a process that had shaped the very landscape they lived in, the very cities they inhabited, the very rivers that gave their civilization its life. The sun moved across the sky above Nippur, casting its hard, bright light over the mud brick walls and the temple platform and the wide, flat plain beyond the city's edge. In the markets near the river gate, traders were laying out their goods: bolts of wool cloth, jars of sesame oil, bundles of dried fish, small copper tools, beads of lapis lazuli brought all the way from the mountains of what is now Afghanistan. The smell of the market was complex and vivid, the sharp smell of fresh fish, the sweet heaviness of date wine, the dusty warmth of wool, the metallic tang of copper freshly worked. Voices rose and fell in the haggling of commerce, in the Sumerian and Akkadian that were both spoken in the cosmopolitan markets of the great Mesopotamian cities. A merchant who had travelled from the city of Ur, several days' journey to the south, might have paused in his trading to look up at the Eka temple rising above the city, and felt the particular reverence that the sight of that building inspired in every Mesopotamian who saw it. This was the house of Enlil, the father of the gods, the lord of wind and storm and the divine decree. This was the place from which kingship had been granted and could be withdrawn. This was the centre of the world in the most literal sense that the ancient Mesopotamian imagination could conceive. And in the scribal school not far from the temple precincts, a student was copying, for perhaps the 10th time, the opening lines of the king list. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. The words came easily now. His hand had learned the signs, his eye could read them without effort. But the meaning behind the words still gave him pause, still opened in his mind that vertiginous sense of depth, of looking back through time into a darkness that the texts illuminated only partially and at great distance. He pressed his stylus into the fresh clay and continued copying name after name, city after city. The long sequence of antediluvian kings with their impossible reigns, moving steadily toward the line that divided everything, the flood, and then continuing on the other side into the more familiar territory of the post-flood kings, whose reigns were still long by any human standard, but were at least within the range of the conceivable. Outside, the afternoon wind was picking up, carrying dust from the fields and the smell of the river. The clay on the practice tablets was beginning to dry at the edges. The day was ending, and the tradition was continuing, and the world that the tradition described, the world before the flood, the world of the antediluvian kings, the world that had ended so completely that only these careful marks in clay preserved any memory of it, was as present in that room as it had ever been, as real in its way as the mud brick walls and the oil lamp and the sound of the wind outside. As the evening settled over Nippur and the first stars appeared above the plain, the student put down his stylus and looked at the tablet he had made. The marks were clean and even, the signs well formed, the text complete. He had done his work well. Tomorrow he would do it again. And the tradition moved forward, one tablet at a time through the long centuries that still lay ahead. The world that the Sumerian scribes inhabited was not a world at peace with itself. It was a world of competing cities, shifting alliances, and the constant pressure of neighbours who wanted what Sumer had: its fertile fields, its trade networks, its accumulated wealth, and the prestige of its ancient religious traditions. The great city-states of the southern plain, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Umma, Kish, and the others, were not a unified nation in any modern sense. They were independent political entities, each with its own ruler, its own patron deity, its own army, and its own ambitions. They traded with each other, intermarried their royal families, shared the same scribal tradition and the same broad religious framework, and occasionally went to war with each other over the control of irrigation water, agricultural land, and the trade routes that connected the Mesopotamian plain to the wider world. The wars between Sumerian city-states were not the great campaigns of annihilation that would characterize later periods of Near Eastern history. They were, for the most part, relatively small-scale affairs: raids, border skirmishes, the occasional pitched battle between the professional soldiers of two rival cities. But they were frequent enough to be a constant feature of the political landscape, and their outcomes could be decisive. A city that lost control of a key irrigation canal might face crop failure and famine. A city whose king was captured or killed in battle might find itself suddenly leaderless and vulnerable. And a city that was sacked by a victorious enemy might lose not just its material wealth, but its scribal archives, its temple treasuries, and the accumulated institutional knowledge that kept its administrative machinery running. This fragility, the constant possibility that everything built up over generations could be swept away in a season, was not merely a background anxiety in Sumerian life. It was a lived experience, repeated often enough that it left deep marks in the culture's literature and religious thought. The great Sumerian lament compositions, long, elaborate poems mourning the destruction of particular cities, are among the most moving documents to survive from the ancient world, and they express with extraordinary vividness the grief of a community that has seen its world taken apart. The lament for the destruction of Ur, composed sometime after the city was sacked by the Elamites around 2004 BCE, describes the abandonment of the city's temples, the scattering of its population, the silencing of its music and commerce, in terms that resonate across the millennia with the force of genuine loss. These lament compositions are relevant to our story because they illuminate the emotional register in which the ancient Mesopotamians experienced the idea of civilizational collapse. The destruction of a city was not merely a political or military event, it was a cosmic catastrophe, a rupture in the divine order, a withdrawal of divine favour, a moment when the gods turned their faces away and allowed the human world to be unmade. The language used to describe the destruction of Ur or Nippur or Lagash is not so different from the language used to describe the flood, the sense of overwhelming force, of helplessness before powers beyond human control, of a world reduced to silence and ruin. This parallel between historical disasters and the mythological flood was not accidental. The Sumerians understood their history as a series of rises and falls, of civilization built up and then swept away, of divine favour granted and then withdrawn. The king list itself encodes this understanding. It is not just a record of who ruled when, but a narrative of how kingship moved from city to city as divine favour shifted, how the great centres of power rose and fell in succession, how the whole enterprise of civilization was contingent on the continued goodwill of forces that no human being could fully control or predict. The political landscape of Mesopotamia shifted dramatically around 2334 BCE, when a man of obscure origins who called himself Sargon, a name that means something like "the king is legitimate," seized power in the city of Kish and proceeded to conquer the entire Mesopotamian plain and beyond. Sargon of Akkad, as he is known to history, was the founder of the world's first empire in the full sense of the word, a political entity that extended across multiple previously independent city-states and was held together by military force, administrative organization, and the personal authority of the ruler. His empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, encompassing not just the Sumerian cities of the south, but the Akkadian-speaking cities of the north, the cedar forests of Lebanon, and the silver mines of Anatolia. Sargon's rise to power was a turning point in Mesopotamian history, and it is relevant to our story in several ways. First, it represents exactly the kind of civilizational transformation that the king list was designed to record. The movement of supreme power from one city to another, the replacement of one ruling tradition by another, the end of one era and the beginning of the next. Sargon's empire was, in a sense, a new world built on the ruins of the old Sumerian city-state system, just as the post-flood world of the king list was a new world built on the ruins of the antediluvian civilization. Second, Sargon's reign accelerated the process by which Akkadian, the Semitic language spoken in the northern part of the Mesopotamian plain, became the dominant language of political and commercial life, gradually displacing Sumerian from its position as the primary language of administration and eventually of everyday speech. Sumerian did not disappear immediately. It remained the language of religious ritual and scribal education for centuries after Akkadian had become the vernacular, but the shift was real and ultimately irreversible. By the middle of the second millennium BCE, Sumerian was a dead language in the sense that no one spoke it as a mother tongue, though it was still written and read by trained scribes who learned it as a classical language, much as medieval European scholars learned Latin. This linguistic shift had important consequences for the transmission of the antediluvian tradition. The Sumerian king list and the Eridu Genesis were composed in Sumerian, and as Akkadian became dominant, these texts had to be translated or adapted for audiences who could no longer read them in the original. The process of translation and adaptation inevitably involved some degree of transformation, not falsification, but the kind of subtle reinterpretation that happens whenever a text is rendered into a new language and a new cultural context. The Akkadian versions of the flood story, as found in the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh cycle, are not simple translations of the Sumerian originals. They are creative reworkings that preserve the essential narrative while adapting it to the different theological and literary sensibilities of the Akkadian tradition. The Akkadian tradition brought with it a somewhat different understanding of the relationship between humans and the divine, one that was perhaps slightly more pessimistic than the Sumerian original. In the Sumerian texts, the flood is presented as a divine decision whose full rationale is not entirely clear, and Ziusudra's survival is an act of divine mercy toward a pious man. In the Akkadian Atrahasis, the flood is explicitly a response to the noise and overpopulation of humanity, a problem that the gods have been trying to solve through various means before resorting to total destruction. And in the Gilgamesh epic, the flood narrative is embedded in a larger story about the impossibility of human immortality. Utnapishtim's eternal life is presented not as a reward to be emulated, but as a unique exception that underscores the rule. Human beings are mortal, and no amount of heroic effort or divine favour will change that. This darker, more resigned tone in the Akkadian tradition reflects, perhaps, the experience of a civilization that had seen more of the world's instability than the early Sumerians had, that had watched empires rise and fall, that had lived through the collapse of Sargon's Akkadian empire after only a few generations, that had seen the great cities of the plains sacked and rebuilt and sacked again. The world of the Akkadian scribes was not the confident, expansive world of early Sumer. It was a world that had already accumulated a considerable history of rise and fall, and that had learned, through that history, to hold its achievements with a certain humility. The Akkadian Empire of Sargon lasted for roughly a century and a half before it collapsed under the pressure of external invasion and internal rebellion. It was succeeded by a period of Gutian domination. The Gutians were a people from the Zagros Mountains whose rule over the Mesopotamian plain was remembered in later tradition as a time of disorder and cultural regression, and then by the third dynasty of Ur, which represented a remarkable revival of Sumerian political and cultural life. The kings of the third dynasty of Ur, particularly Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi, were great builders and administrators who unified the Mesopotamian plain under a centralized bureaucracy of extraordinary efficiency, and who were also enthusiastic patrons of the scribal arts. It was during the third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 to 2000 BCE, that the Sumerian king list appears to have been compiled in something close to its final form. The political purpose of the compilation is not difficult to discern, by presenting the history of Mesopotamian kingship as a single continuous sequence, with supreme power moving from city to city, but but always remaining within the same divinely ordained framework, the compilers were making a claim for the legitimacy of the current rulers, the kings of Ur, as the latest and most exalted holders of a tradition that stretched back to the very beginning of the world. The antediluvian kings, with their impossible reigns and their direct connection to the divine, lent an aura of cosmic authority to the entire sequence, including its most recent members. This political dimension of the king list does not invalidate it as a historical source, but it does remind us that ancient documents were rarely created in a vacuum of pure scholarly interest. They were created by people with purposes, in contexts with pressures, and those purposes and pressures shaped what was recorded and how. The compilers of the king list were not disinterested historians. They were scribes working in the service of a royal court that had specific reasons for wanting a particular version of the past to be preserved and promulgated. The antediluvian tradition they incorporated into their compilation was, in all likelihood, genuinely ancient, older than the third dynasty of Ur, older perhaps than the earliest written records. But the way they framed it, the context they placed it in, the political use they made of it, these were choices made in a specific historical moment for specific historical reasons. Understanding this does not diminish the interest of the tradition. If anything, it deepens it, because it means that the antediluvian kings list is not just a record of what the ancient Mesopotamians believed about the deep past. It is also a document about how they used that belief, how they deployed the memory of a world before the flood as a resource for legitimating power and authority in the present. The kings of Ur were not merely claiming descent from a long line of predecessors. They were claiming a place in a cosmic narrative that began before the flood and would continue, presumably, until the gods decided otherwise. They were inserting themselves into a story that was older than history and larger than any individual dynasty. The rival traditions that challenged and complicated the Sumerian king list came from several directions. The Akkadian flood narrative, as we have seen, offered a somewhat different framing of the antediluvian world. But there were also traditions from other parts of the ancient Near East that preserved their own versions of the story of the world before the flood, and these traditions both confirm the broad outlines of the Mesopotamian account and introduce variations that suggest the tradition was more complex and multifaceted than any single text can capture. One of the most interesting of these parallel traditions comes from a source that is, in a sense, the most distant from the original Sumerian context, the work of a Babylonian priest named Berossus, who lived in the 3rd century BCE and wrote a history of Babylon in Greek for a Greek-speaking audience. Berossus's original work does not survive. It is known only through quotations and summaries preserved in later authors. But what does survive is remarkable. Berossus described 10 antediluvian kings, ruling over a period of 432,000 years before the flood. The names he gives are different from those in the Sumerian king list, though some scholars have proposed correspondences between them. And the total duration of the antediluvian period, 432,000 years, is itself a number of considerable interest, because it is exactly 120 times the Babylonian Shah, a unit of 3,600 years, and it has mathematical relationships to several other significant numbers in Mesopotamian astronomical and calendrical calculation. Berossus was writing in a world very different from that of the original Sumerian scribes. By his time, the great civilization of ancient Mesopotamia was in its final phase. The Persian Empire had conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, and the Macedonian conquest under Alexander the Great in 331 BCE had opened Mesopotamia to Greek cultural influence. Berossus was a product of this mixed world, a Babylonian priest who had absorbed Greek learning and was trying to present his own civilization's traditions in a form that Greek readers could appreciate and respect. His account of the antediluvian kings is both a preservation of the ancient tradition and an adaptation of it, shaped by his particular moment and his particular audience, but drawing on sources that went back to the earliest layers of Mesopotamian scribal learning. The fact that Berossus's account agrees in its broad outlines with the Sumerian king list, 10 antediluvian rulers, an enormous span of time, a flood that ends the First Age, while differing in its details, suggests that both are drawing on a common tradition that was already ancient by the time either of them was written down. The tradition had been transmitted through the centuries, adapted and elaborated by each culture that received it, but retaining its essential core, the memory of a world before the flood, with its own rulers and its own civilization, swept away by a catastrophe and replaced by the world we know. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which we have already encountered in its role as a vehicle for the flood narrative, also engages with the antediluvian tradition in another, less obvious way. Gilgamesh himself, according to the king list, was a post-flood king, the fifth king of the first dynasty of Uruk after the flood. But he is described in the prologue of the epic as a man who went to the ends of the earth and returned, who saw everything and knew everything, who brought back knowledge of the time before the flood and had it inscribed on a tablet of lapis lazuli. This image, of a hero who recovers the knowledge of the antediluvian world and preserves it in written form, is one of the most evocative in all of ancient literature. It suggests that the ancient Mesopotamians understood the preservation of antediluvian knowledge as itself a heroic act, an achievement comparable to the great physical exploits of the legendary kings. The tablet of lapis lazuli, on which Gilgamesh inscribed his knowledge, is, of course, a literary device rather than a historical artifact, but it is a device that speaks directly to the concerns of the scribal tradition, the belief that knowledge must be written down to be preserved, that the act of inscription is itself an act of salvation, that the tablet is the vessel through which the past is carried into the future. In this sense, the Gilgamesh prologue is a meditation on the very activity that the scribes of Nippur and Ur and Babylon were engaged in every day, the work of preserving in durable form the knowledge of what had been, so that the future would not be entirely ignorant of the past. The question of what the antediluvian tradition meant to the people who preserved it, what they actually believed about the world before the flood, how literally they took the impossible reigns of the antediluvian kings, what emotional and intellectual relationship they had with this vast dark prehistory, is one that we cannot answer with certainty. The ancient texts do not give us direct access to the inner lives of the scribes who copied them. We cannot know whether a student at the Adaba in Nippur, copying the king list for the 100th time, thought of the antediluvian kings as real historical figures or as mythological constructs, as literal ancestors or as symbolic representations of a primordial age. We cannot know whether the impossible reigns seemed to him as obviously impossible as they seem to us, or whether the different scale of antediluvian time was simply accepted as a feature of a different kind of world. What we can say is that the tradition was treated with great seriousness and preserved with great care, and that it occupied a central place in the scribal curriculum for as long as that curriculum existed. Whatever the scribes believed about the literal truth of the antediluvian tradition, they clearly believed that it was important, that it needed to be known, copied, transmitted, and kept alive. And that belief, expressed in the patient, daily work of pressing reed into clay, is itself a kind of testimony to the power of the tradition and the depth of the human need to remember what came before. The sun was moving toward the western horizon, and the shadows of the mud-brick buildings in Nippur were growing long and cool. In the market, the traders were packing up their remaining goods, covering their jars with cloth against the evening dust. The smell of cooking fires was beginning to rise from the domestic quarters of the city, the smell of barley bread and roasting onions and the sharp, clean scent of burning reed. Children were being called in from their play in the narrow streets, their voices carrying clearly in the cooling air. In the scribal school, the last tablets of the day were being set aside to dry. The teacher was checking the work of his most advanced students, a group of young men who were copying for the first time the great literary compositions of the Sumerian tradition. One of them had just finished a copy of the opening section of the king list, and the teacher bent over it, reading the signs with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his entire life in the company of cuneiform. The signs were well formed, the lines straight, the spacing even. He nodded, and the student allowed himself a small, quiet satisfaction. Outside, the evening star appeared above the western horizon, the same star that the Sumerians associated with the goddess Inanna, the same star that had hung in the same place in the same sky, above the antediluvian cities, above the flood, above the long centuries of rebuilding that had produced the world the student knew. The star did not change, the sky did not change, only the world below it changed, endlessly and irreversibly, carrying its cargo of memory and loss from one age to the next. The teacher set down the tablet and moved to the next student. The evening deepened, the city settled into its nighttime rhythms, and somewhere beneath the floor of the scribal school, in the deep layers of soil that no one in Nippur would ever excavate, lay the remains of buildings and objects from earlier centuries, Earlier cities, earlier lives, earlier attempts at civilization, pressing quietly down into the earth, patient and permanent, waiting for a future they could not have imagined. A generation passed, then another, and the tradition kept moving, carried in the hands and minds of the scribes, from one age of the world into the next. The pressures that bore down on the civilization of ancient Mesopotamia were not always visible from inside the cities themselves. A farmer working his field in the shadow of Nippur's walls, watching the water move through the irrigation channels he had helped to dig, might have felt that the world was stable and comprehensible, that the rhythm of planting and harvest, of flood and recession, of festival and ordinary day would continue indefinitely in the pattern he had always known. The walls of the city rose solid and permanent behind him. The temple platform of the Ekka caught the morning light with the same authority it had displayed for as long as anyone could remember. The priests performed their rituals, the scribes copied their texts, the merchants moved their goods along the river roads, and the world seemed to hold. But the world was not holding. Not entirely. The pressures were real, and they came from multiple directions simultaneously, and the civilization that had produced the scribal schools and the king list, and the great mythological compositions was, by the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, already living in the long shadow of changes that would eventually transform it beyond recognition. The first and most persistent of these pressures was environmental. The irrigation agriculture that made Sumerian civilization possible was also, over the long term, undermining it. The practice of directing river water onto the fields, season after season, year after year, gradually raised the water table in the southern plain and increased the concentration of dissolved salts in the soil. Salt is the enemy of barley, the staple crop of Mesopotamia, and as the salinity of the fields increased, yields declined. The ancient agricultural texts record this process with a kind of quiet despair. The same fields that had once produced abundant harvests were producing less and less, and no amount of additional irrigation could reverse the trend. Farmers shifted from barley to more salt-tolerant crops where they could, but the fundamental problem remained. The land was slowly becoming less productive, and the population that depended on it was not decreasing. Scholars who have studied the agricultural records of ancient Sumer have found evidence of this salinization process in the declining grain yields recorded in administrative tablets from the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. The numbers tell a story of gradual but irreversible decline, not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, grinding deterioration that must have been experienced by each generation as a worsening of conditions that had already been difficult, a tightening of margins that were already thin. The great cities of the southern plain, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, did not fall in a day. They declined over centuries, their population shrinking, their temples falling into disrepair, their agricultural hinterlands producing less and less to support the urban centres that depended on them. This environmental decline was compounded by the political instability that was a constant feature of Mesopotamian life. The third dynasty of Ur, which had represented such a remarkable flowering of Sumerian culture, and had probably been the context in which the Sumerian king list was compiled in its final form, collapsed around 2004 BCE under the combined pressure of Elamite invasion from the east and the infiltration of Amorite peoples from the west. The Elamites sacked Kia, carrying off its last king as a prisoner, and the great city that had been the centre of the Sumerian world was left diminished and vulnerable. The lament for the destruction of Ur, composed in the aftermath of this catastrophe, gives voice to the grief of a civilization that has seen its greatest achievement undone. The temples abandoned, the divine statues carried away, the people scattered, the carefully maintained irrigation system falling into disrepair. The Amorites, who had been moving into the Mesopotamian plain from the Syrian steppe over the preceding centuries, were not destroyers in the same sense as the Elamites. They were semi-nomadic pastoralists who had long maintained a complex relationship with the settled agricultural communities of the plain, sometimes raiding them, sometimes trading with them, sometimes serving as mercenary soldiers in their armies. As the central authority of the third dynasty of Ur weakened, the Amorites were able to establish themselves in positions of power in various Mesopotamian cities, and within a few generations they had become the ruling class of a new political order, one that was, in its broad outlines, a continuation of the Mesopotamian tradition, but that also brought new emphasis and new directions. The most famous of the Amorite dynasties was the first dynasty of Babylon, which reached its greatest extent under the king Hammurabi, who ruled from approximately 1792 to 1750 BCE. Hammurabi is best known today for his law code, a collection of legal principles inscribed on a tall black stele that was found at Susa in 1901 and is now in the Louvre in Paris. But Hammurabi was also a great patron of the scribal arts, and his reign saw a flowering of literary and intellectual activity in Babylon that produced some of the most important documents in the Mesopotamian tradition, including the version of the Atrahasis epic that is our most complete source for the Akkadian flood narrative. Under Hammurabi and his successors, Babylon became the dominant city of Mesopotamia, and the Babylonian version of the Mesopotamian cultural tradition, its language, its literature, its religious practices, its scribal conventions, became the standard against which all others were measured. The old Sumerian traditions were not abandoned. They were absorbed, translated, and adapted into the Babylonian framework, which treated them with great respect even as it reshaped them to fit new purposes. The scribal schools of Babylon continued to teach Sumerian as a classical language, continued to copy the great Sumerian literary compositions, continued to transmit the antediluvian tradition in forms that preserved its essential character while giving it a new Babylonian colouring. It was in this Babylonian context that the flood narrative received its most elaborate and literary treatment, the version embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh that we have already encountered. The Babylonian scribes who composed and refined the Gilgamesh epic were not simply preserving an ancient tradition. They were creating a work of literature of the highest order, a meditation on mortality, friendship, loss, and the limits of human aspiration that speaks with remarkable directness across the millennia to readers of any culture and any era. The flood narrative within the epic is not merely a set piece or a digression. It is the climax of Gilgamesh's quest, the moment when he learns, from the one man who has survived the flood and been granted immortality, that the life he is seeking is not available to him. The antediluvian world in this telling is the world of a different kind of being, a world that has been permanently closed off, accessible only through story and memory, never through direct experience. The Babylonian period also saw the development of a more systematic approach to the question of the antediluvian world and its relationship to the present. Babylonian scholars, and they were scholars in a meaningful sense, men who studied texts with critical attention and sought to understand the traditions they had inherited rather than merely copying them, were interested in the question of how the antediluvian tradition fit with the rest of what they knew about history and cosmology. They compared different versions of the king list, noted the discrepancies between them, and attempted to reconcile the impossible reigns of the antediluvian kings with their understanding of how time and history actually worked. Some of these reconciliation attempts survive in the form of marginal notes and commentary texts that accompany the main literary compositions. They suggest a tradition of active intellectual engagement with the antediluvian material, not blind acceptance of everything the tradition said, but a thoughtful attempt to understand what it meant and how it related to other knowledge. This scholarly tradition within the scribal schools is one of the most interesting features of Mesopotamian intellectual life, and it anticipates in some ways the critical scholarship that would eventually be applied to these same texts by modern researchers thousands of years later. The neighbours and rivals of Babylon also had their own relationships with the antediluvian tradition. The Assyrians, who dominated the northern part of Mesopotamia, from their capital cities of Assur and Nineveh, were heirs to the same broad cultural tradition as the Babylonians, and their scribal schools copied and preserved the same texts. But the Assyrian tradition had its own emphases and its own character, shaped by the different environment of the northern plain, drier, cooler, more exposed to the mountain peoples of the Zagros and the nomads of the Syrian steppe, and by the more explicitly militaristic character of Assyrian political culture. The Assyrian kings were great warriors and great builders, and they were also, somewhat surprisingly, great collectors of texts. The most famous example of this collecting impulse is the library assembled at Nineveh by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who ruled from approximately 668 to 627 BCE. Ashurbanipal was an unusual figure in the ancient world, a king who was also a trained scribe, who could read and write cuneiform in both Sumerian and Akkadian, and who had a genuine intellectual passion for the literary and scholarly traditions of his civilization. He sent agents throughout Mesopotamia to collect tablets from temple libraries and private collections, and had them copied and brought to his palace at Nineveh, where they were organised and catalogued in what amounted to the first systematic library in history. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh contained tens of thousands of tablets covering an enormous range of subjects: omens and divination, astronomy and mathematics, medicine and magic, history and mythology, hymns and laments and wisdom literature. Among them were multiple copies of the Gilgamesh epic, the Atrahasis flood narrative, and other texts that touched on the antediluvian tradition. It was from this library that the tablets discovered by Austen Henry Layard and his successors in the 19th century came, the tablets that would eventually lead to the decipherment of cuneiform and the rediscovery of the Mesopotamian literary tradition after its long sleep beneath the desert sand. But before we reach that moment of rediscovery, we must follow the tradition through the crises and transformations that lay between the height of Babylonian and Assyrian civilization and the eventual extinction of the cuneiform scribal tradition. And those crises were severe. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which Ashurbanipal represented at its height, was the most powerful political entity the ancient Near East had ever seen. At its greatest extent, it controlled territory stretching from Egypt in the west to the borders of Iran in the east, from the mountains of Anatolia in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. Its armies were the most formidable of their age, its administrative system the most sophisticated, its cultural life the most cosmopolitan, and yet within a generation of Ashurbanipal's death, it was gone. The fall of the Assyrian Empire was sudden and catastrophic in a way that the slower declines of earlier Mesopotamian civilizations had not been. A coalition of Babylonians and Medes, peoples from the Iranian plateau who had long chafed under Assyrian domination, attacked the Assyrian heartland in the 610s BCE, and within a few years had destroyed the empire's major cities one by one. Assur fell in 614 BCE. Nineveh fell in 612 BCE. The great library that Ashurbanipal had assembled was buried under the ruins of the burning palace, the tablets falling from their shelves as the roof collapsed and the fire spread through the rooms. The clay tablets survived the fire. Indeed, the heat of the burning palace actually baked many of them more thoroughly than they had been before, making them more durable, but they were buried under meters of debris and forgotten for more than 2,000 years. The fall of Nineveh was experienced by the peoples of the ancient Near East as a world historical event of the First Order. The Assyrians had been the dominant power for so long, their empire so seemingly invincible, that its sudden collapse was genuinely shocking. The biblical book of Nahum, composed around the time of Nineveh's fall, expresses a kind of grim satisfaction at the city's destruction. The great oppressor brought low, the mighty humbled, the empire that had seemed permanent revealed as fragile. But there was also, surely, something more complex in the response of those who had lived under Assyrian rule, a mixture of relief and uncertainty, of freedom and vulnerability, of the strange disorientation that comes when a structure that has organized your world for generations is suddenly gone. The Babylonians, who replaced the Assyrians as the dominant power in Mesopotamia, inherited the Assyrian cultural tradition, along with its political territory. The Neo-Babylonian Empire under kings like Nebuchadnezzar II was in many ways a continuation of the Mesopotamian scribal and religious tradition. The same temples, the same texts, the same gods, the same festivals. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt Babylon on a magnificent scale, constructing the Great Ishtar Gate with its brilliant blue-glazed bricks and its processions of lions and dragons, rebuilding the Temple of Marduk, and generally presenting himself as the legitimate heir of the entire Mesopotamian tradition, going back to the very beginning. The scribal schools of Neo-Babylonian Babylon continued to copy and transmit the ancient texts, including the antediluvian tradition. But the world around them was changing in ways that would eventually make the entire tradition irrelevant to most of the people living in Mesopotamia. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE, accomplished by Cyrus the Great with relatively little violence, brought Mesopotamia into a new political and cultural framework, one in which Aramaic, a Semitic language written in an alphabetic script rather than cuneiform, gradually displaced the ancient writing system in everyday use. Cuneiform continued to be used for religious and scholarly purposes for several more centuries, but its base of practitioners was shrinking, and the tradition it carried was becoming increasingly the property of a small number of specialists, rather than the common intellectual heritage of an entire civilization. The tension between the old cuneiform tradition and the new alphabetic world is one of the most poignant themes in the late history of Mesopotamian scribal culture. The scribes who continued to copy the ancient texts in the Seleucid and Parthian periods, the centuries after Alexander's conquest, when Greek and then Iranian cultures overlaid the ancient Mesopotamian substrate, were doing so in full awareness that they were preserving something that was becoming rare and endangered. The colophons that scribes added to the ends of their tablets in this period sometimes include explicit statements about the importance of preserving the ancient learning, warnings that the texts should not be shown to the uninitiated, expressions of pride in belonging to a tradition that stretched back to the antediluvian world itself. One such colophon from a late Babylonian tablet identifies the scribe as a descendant of an ancient scribal family and claims that the knowledge he is recording goes back to the time before the flood, that it is, in a sense, antediluvian knowledge, preserved through the catastrophe and transmitted through the long centuries to the present. Whether this claim was literally believed or was a conventional expression of the tradition's antiquity is impossible to say with certainty, but it speaks to the deep identification of the scribal tradition with the antediluvian world, the sense that the knowledge the scribes carried was itself a kind of survival from the time before, a thread connecting the present to the deep past across the divide of the flood. The last cuneiform tablets that can be dated with certainty come from the 1st century of the Common Era, tablets from Babylon and from the city of Uruk that record astronomical observations in the ancient script, maintained by a small community of specialists who were the final inheritors of a tradition that had begun more than 3,000 years earlier. After that, the silence falls. The last scribes died, and with them died the living knowledge of cuneiform. The tablets they had spent their lives copying and preserving were buried under the ruins of the cities that had housed them, or scattered and broken, or simply abandoned in buildings that eventually collapsed and covered them with debris. The tradition that had begun with the simple accounting marks of Uruk around 3300 BCE ended not with a dramatic catastrophe, but with a quiet fading, the last flame of a fire that had burned for millennia, going out in the darkness of a world that had moved on to other scripts, other languages, other ways of recording and preserving the past, and in that darkness the tablets waited, millions of them, scattered across the mounds that were all that remained of the great Mesopotamian cities, lying in the soil through the long centuries of the Common Era, through the rise and fall of empires that had never heard of Sumer or Akkad, through the coming of Islam and the slow transformation of the Mesopotamian landscape, through the Ottoman period and the gradual opening of the region to European travellers and scholars. They waited, patient and permanent, in the same way that clay always waits, without urgency, without anxiety, without any sense of the time passing above them. The mounds themselves became part of the landscape, so familiar that the people who lived near them gave them names, and sometimes built their own villages on top of them, using the ancient mud brick as building material, occasionally turning up tablets in their fields without knowing what they were. The tablets were sometimes used as fuel, sometimes discarded, sometimes kept as curious objects whose purpose was not understood. The knowledge pressed into their surfaces in careful rows of wedge-shaped marks lay dormant, inaccessible, waiting for someone who could read it. That someone would not come for a very long time. The world that had produced the tablets had been so thoroughly forgotten that when European travellers began to visit the mounds of Mesopotamia in the 16th and 17th centuries, they had only the vaguest idea of what lay beneath them. They knew, from the biblical accounts, and from the writings of classical Greek and Roman authors, that there had once been great cities in this region, Babylon, Nineveh, Ur. But the connection between the ancient names and the specific mounds of earth that dotted the Iraqi plain was not clear, and the idea that those mounds might contain millions of inscribed clay tablets, recording the literature and history of a civilization that predated the Bible, was simply not part of anyone's mental framework. The slow process by which that understanding was built, by which the mounds were identified, excavated, and their contents decoded, is one of the great intellectual adventures of the modern era, and it forms the final chapter of our story tonight. But before we reach it, we must linger for a moment in the long silence between the last cuneiform scribe and the first modern archaeologist, the silence in which the tablets lay, and the tradition they carried waited, and the world above them changed and changed again, not knowing what it was standing on. The wind moved across the mounds of ancient Nippur and Ur and Nineveh, carrying dust from one side to the other, as it had always done. The stars turned overhead in their familiar patterns, the same patterns that the Sumerian astronomers had mapped and named and used to anchor their understanding of time. The rivers continued to flood each spring and recede each autumn, spreading their silt across the plain, nourishing the fields that fed the people who lived there, generation after generation, in the long interval between the end of one world and the beginning of another. And deep in the earth, in the darkness below the roots of the crops and the foundations of the villages, the tablets waited with the patience of clay, carrying their cargo of memory through the centuries, intact and silent, ready for the moment when someone would reach down and lift them into the light. The silence above the mounds of ancient Mesopotamia lasted a very long time. Centuries accumulated over the buried tablets, like layers of sediment over a riverbed. Each generation of people living and dying on the surface of a world they did not know was built on the remains of something far older and far stranger than anything in their experience. The villages that grew up near the Great Mounds used the ancient mud brick as building material, quarrying the compressed debris of millennia for the same practical purpose that had originally produced it. Farmers ploughed fields that had once been the courtyards of temple complexes, turning up fragments of pottery and occasional pieces of inscribed clay that they did not recognize as writing and could not read. The landscape held its secrets with the complete indifference of the inanimate, giving nothing away. The first Europeans to take a serious interest in the mounds of Mesopotamia were travellers and diplomats who passed through the region in the 16th and 17th centuries, often on their way to or from Persia or India. These travellers knew their Bible, and they knew their classical sources, and when they looked at the flat plain between the two rivers, with its scattered hills of compressed earth, they tried to match what they saw with what they had read. Pietro della Valle, an Italian nobleman who travelled through Mesopotamia in the early 17th century, visited the site of ancient Babylon and brought back with him some inscribed bricks, the first cuneiform texts to reach Europe in modern times. He recognised that the marks on the bricks were a form of writing, but he had no way of knowing what language they represented or what they said. The bricks that Della Valle and other early travellers brought back to Europe attracted the attention of scholars who were fascinated by the possibility of an ancient writing system that had been entirely forgotten. The marks were clearly systematic. They had the regularity of a script, not the randomness of decoration, but they were unlike any writing system known from the classical or biblical traditions. They were not Hebrew, not Greek, not Latin, not Arabic. They were something else entirely, something that had no living practitioners and no tradition of interpretation that anyone could point to. The decipherment of cuneiform was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 19th century, and it was accomplished through a combination of brilliant individual effort and fortunate circumstance. The key that unlocked the script was the same kind of key that had unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics a few decades earlier, a bilingual or multilingual inscription, in which the same text was written in both the unknown script and a known language, allowing scholars to work out the correspondence between the two systems. The crucial inscription for cuneiform was the Behistun Rock, a massive cliff face in western Iran on which the Persian king Darius the Great had carved a long inscription in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, around 520 BCE. The inscription was carved high on the cliff, essentially inaccessible, and for centuries it had been seen by travellers who could not get close enough to copy it properly. In the 1830s and 1840s, a young British Army officer named Henry Rawlinson undertook the extraordinary physical feat of climbing the cliff face, hanging from ropes on the sheer rock, to copy the inscriptions carefully enough for scholarly analysis. His copies, combined with the work of other scholars who were independently analysing cuneiform texts from other sources, eventually allowed the decipherment to proceed. The process was slow and painstaking, requiring years of work by multiple scholars in several countries. The Old Persian portion of the Behistun inscription was deciphered first, because Old Persian was a language related to known Indo-European languages and could be worked out with considerable effort from the patterns of the signs. Once the Old Persian text was understood, it provided a key to the Babylonian version of the same text, and from there the broader Akkadian cuneiform system could be gradually worked out. Sumerian, which was a completely different language with no known relatives, took longer still to decode, and a full scholarly consensus on its reading was not achieved until well into the second half of the 19th century. The decipherment was a collective achievement, but certain names stand out. Rawlinson himself made crucial contributions to the Akkadian portion. Georg Friedrich Grotefend, a German schoolteacher, had made the first significant breakthrough in Old Persian decipherment decades earlier. Edward Hincks, an Irish clergyman with a remarkable gift for linguistic analysis, contributed fundamental insights to both Akkadian and Sumerian. Jules Oppert, a French scholar, helped establish the existence of Sumerian as a distinct language separate from Akkadian, and Archibald Henry Sayce, among others, helped consolidate and disseminate the results of the decipherment to a wider scholarly audience. While the decipherment was proceeding, the excavations of the Mesopotamian mounds were producing a flood of new material that both drove and complicated the scholarly work. Austin Henry Layard, a young English adventurer who had been travelling in the Near East in the 1840s, obtained permission from the Ottoman authorities to excavate the mound of Nimrud, south of Mosul in northern Iraq. What he found there astonished him and the world. The remains of the Assyrian palace of Nimrud, with its massive stone reliefs carved with scenes of royal hunts and military campaigns, its colossal winged bulls that had guarded the palace gates, and its collections of inscribed tablets and objects. Layard's discoveries made him famous almost overnight, and he followed them up with excavations at Nineveh itself, where he found the remains of Sennacherib's palace and eventually the first portions of Ashurbanipal's Great Library. The tablets from Nineveh were shipped to the British Museum in London in large quantities, arriving in crates and baskets, often broken and fragmentary, mixed with soil and debris from the excavations. The task of sorting, cataloguing and reading them fell to the museum's curators and to a remarkable group of scholars who devoted their careers to the work. Among them was a young man named George Smith, who had begun his career as an engraver but had taught himself cuneiform from the tablets in the British Museum's collection and had become, by his early 30s, one of the leading experts on Assyrian texts. In November 1872, George Smith was working through a collection of tablet fragments from Nineveh when he found a piece that, as he read it, made him stop completely. The fragment described a great flood, a man warned by a god, a boat built to survive the rising waters, animals loaded aboard, the flood lasting for days, a bird released to test the receding of the waters. The parallels with the biblical story of Noah were unmistakable, and Smith, a religious man as well as a scholar, was so overcome by the realization of what he was reading that he is said to have jumped up from his desk and begun pacing the room, too excited to sit still. The tablet he'd found was a portion of the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the tablet that contained the flood narrative told by Utnapishtim. Smith's announcement of his discovery, made at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Archaeology in December 1872, caused a sensation that went far beyond the usual circles of academic scholarship. The newspapers reported it as one of the most significant discoveries of the age. Here was evidence pressed into clay by Babylonian scribes nearly 3,000 years ago of a flood story that predated the Bible and yet told essentially the same tale. The implications for the relationship between biblical narrative and ancient Near Eastern tradition were profound, and they were debated with great intensity in both scholarly and religious circles. The excitement surrounding Smith's discovery led to a remarkable episode that illustrates the public appetite for ancient knowledge in the Victorian era. The Daily Telegraph newspaper offered to fund an expedition to Nineveh to search for the missing portions of the flood tablet, portions that Smith believed were still buried in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library. Smith himself led the expedition, travelling to Mosul in the spring of 1873, and in what seemed almost too good to be true, he found the missing fragment within a few days of beginning his excavations, a piece of clay that fit perfectly with the fragments already in London, and filled in much of the gap in the flood narrative. The discovery of the Gilgamesh flood narrative was the most dramatic moment in the early history of Assyriology, but it was followed by many others as the tablets from Nineveh and other sites were gradually read and their contents understood. The Atrahasis epic, with its more complete account of the antediluvian world and the reasons for the flood, was identified and published. The Sumerian king list was found in multiple copies and its contents analysed. The Eridu Genesis and other Sumerian mythological texts were deciphered. Piece by piece, the intellectual world of ancient Mesopotamia was reconstructed from the fragments that had survived the millennia, and the tradition of the antediluvian civilization was revealed in its full complexity for the first time since the last cuneiform scribe had set down his stylus. The scholarly response to these discoveries was, inevitably, complex and sometimes contentious. The most immediate and heated debate was about the relationship between the Mesopotamian flood traditions and the biblical narrative of Noah. Some scholars argue that the biblical account was directly derived from the Babylonian, that the authors of Genesis had borrowed the flood story from Mesopotamian sources during the period of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. Others argued for a common source underlying both traditions, a shared ancient Near Eastern flood narrative from which both the Mesopotamian and biblical versions had independently derived. Still others maintained that the parallels, while striking, did not necessarily imply direct borrowing, and that similar stories could have developed independently in different cultures that shared the experience of catastrophic flooding. The debate about the relationship between the Mesopotamian and biblical flood traditions has never been entirely resolved, and it continues in various forms to the present day. But the scholarly consensus that has emerged over the past century and a half is broadly that the biblical flood narrative is related to the Mesopotamian tradition, that the relationship is one of cultural transmission rather than independent invention, and that the direction of transmission was from Mesopotamia to the biblical tradition rather than the reverse. The Mesopotamian texts are older, they are more elaborate in their details, and they exist in a cultural context that is demonstrably the source of many other elements of the biblical tradition. But the question of the flood narrative's origins is, in a sense, a secondary matter for our story tonight. The primary question, the question that the Sumerian king list raises so quietly and so insistently, is not about the flood itself, but about what came before it. The antediluvian world, the 6 cities and their kings with their impossible reigns, the civilization that the flood swept away. What was it? Was it real? What does it mean that the ancient Mesopotamians believed it had existed? Modern scholarship has approached these questions from several different angles, and the answers that have emerged are more nuanced and more interesting than either a simple yes or a simple no. The most straightforward answer is that the antediluvian tradition is mythological, that the impossible reigns of the antediluvian kings are not literal historical data, but symbolic expressions of the idea that the world before the flood was qualitatively different from the present world, belonging to a different order of time and reality. This is the mainstream scholarly view, and it is well supported by the internal evidence of the texts themselves, which treat the antediluvian period in a different register from the historical period that follows the flood. But this answer, while correct as far as it goes, does not exhaust the interest of the tradition. Because even if the antediluvian kings are mythological figures rather than historical ones, the tradition that preserves them is itself a historical artifact, a document created by real people in a real historical context, reflecting real concerns and real ways of understanding the world. And when we ask what concerns and what understandings are reflected in the tradition, we find something more complex and more revealing than simple mythology. One of the most important insights that modern scholarship has brought to the antediluvian tradition is the recognition that it encodes a specific theory of history, a theory in which the present world is not the first world, in which the current order of things is not the original order, in which there have been previous attempts at civilization that were ended by catastrophe and replaced by new beginnings. This theory of history is not unique to Mesopotamia. It appears, in various forms, in traditions from around the world: the Hindu doctrine of the Yugas or world ages, the Greek tradition of successive races of humanity, the Mesoamerican concept of multiple suns or world eras. The widespread occurrence of this idea suggests that it taps into something deep in human experience, perhaps the observation that civilizations do indeed rise and fall, that the world one inherits is always built on the ruins of something older, that the past is not a simple linear progression toward the present, but a series of attempts and failures and new beginnings. In Mesopotamia, this general theory of cyclical history was given a specific, local form by the antediluvian tradition. The 5 cities and 8 kings of the Sumerian king list represent not just a mythological prehistory, but a claim about the nature of civilization itself, that it is something that descends from heaven, that it can be lost, that it can be recovered, that it is always contingent on forces beyond human control. The flood that ends the antediluvian world is not just a natural disaster. It is a divine judgment, a reset, a clearing away of what has become too old or too corrupted or too remote from its divine origins. And the new beginning that follows is not just a continuation, it is a fresh start, a second chance, a new attempt at the project of civilization under new conditions. This understanding of history, cyclical, divinely governed, punctuated by catastrophes that clear the way for new beginnings, was not merely an abstract philosophical position for the ancient Mesopotamians. It was a practical framework for understanding their own experience. They lived in a world that had seen empires rise and fall, cities built and destroyed, the accumulated work of generations swept away by flood or war, or the slow grinding of environmental decline. The antediluvian tradition gave them a way to make sense of this experience, to place it within a larger pattern that extended back before the beginning of recorded history, and that connected the contingencies of human life to the purposeful order of the divine. The scribes who copied the king list in the Adaba of Nippur were not just preserving an ancient tradition, they were maintaining a framework for understanding the world, a framework that told them where they stood in the long arc of cosmic history, what had come before them, what had been lost, and what it meant to be living in this particular moment of the world's long story. The tradition was not comforting in any simple sense. It offered no guarantee that the present civilization would endure any more than the antediluvian one had. But it was orienting. It placed the present in a context that extended far beyond the individual lifetime, or even the historical period, and it suggested that even catastrophic loss was not the end of the story, that after the flood, kingship descended from heaven again, and the work of civilization continued. The question of whether there was any real historical basis for the antediluvian tradition, whether the 5 cities and their kings represent some genuine memory of an earlier period of human settlement in Mesopotamia, is one that archaeology has addressed with considerable sophistication over the past century. The answer, as we have already touched on, is complex. The cities named in the king list are all real cities, and all of them have archaeological histories that extend back well before the historical period. Eridu, as we have seen, has a sequence of temple structures going back to approximately 5400 BCE. Shuruppak, Sippar, Bad Tibira and Larak are all attested in the archaeological record from early periods. The fact that these particular cities were chosen as the seats of the antediluvian kings may reflect a genuine memory of their antiquity, a tradition that recognized them as among the oldest inhabited places in the region. Moreover, the archaeological evidence from these sites does preserve traces of major flooding events. At Shuruppak, excavations found a layer of water-deposited silt similar to the one Woolley found at Ur, dating to approximately 2900 BCE. This date is interesting because it falls within the range of the early dynastic period, the period that the king list presents as the beginning of post-flood history. The flood deposit at Shuruppak may represent the kind of major local inundation that, in the memory of later generations, became associated with the great flood of the mythological tradition. But none of this constitutes evidence for a literal antediluvian civilization of the kind described in the king list, a civilization of cities and kings stretching back tens of thousands of years before the historical period. The archaeological record of Mesopotamia is rich and detailed enough that we can say with confidence that there was no such civilization in the literal sense. The human settlement of the Mesopotamian plain was a gradual process that unfolded over thousands of years, from the first farming villages of the 7th millennium BCE to the emergence of cities in the 4th millennium, and at no point in this process do we find evidence of a civilization that was then destroyed by a flood and replaced by another. What we find instead is exactly what we might expect from a tradition that has been shaped by the concerns and the cosmological framework of the historical Mesopotamians, a mythologized account of the deep past that uses the names of real places and the framework of real historical experience to express ideas about the nature of civilization, the relationship between humans and the divine, and the meaning of catastrophe and renewal. The antediluvian tradition is not history in the modern sense, but it is something perhaps more interesting, a window into the historical consciousness of a civilization that understood its own place in time in ways that are both deeply foreign to modern ways of thinking, and, in their broad outlines, surprisingly familiar. The evening was settling over the Mesopotamian plain, and the air was cooling rapidly in the way it does in that part of the world. where the heat of the day can give way to a surprising chill as the sun drops below the horizon. The mounds of the ancient cities stood against the darkening sky, their irregular profiles softened by the fading light, their surfaces still warm from the day's sun. Somewhere beneath them, in the layers of compressed debris that represented thousands of years of human occupation, the tablets waited, those that had survived the long centuries of burial, those that had not been broken or dissolved by moisture or crushed by the weight of the earth above them. And in the museums of London and Philadelphia and Istanbul and Baghdad, the tablets that had already been excavated and deciphered lay in their display cases or their storage drawers, their surfaces covered in the tiny wedge-shaped marks that carried, among so many other things, the memory of a world that had existed before the flood. The marks were as clear as the day they were made. The clay was as hard and permanent as the scribes who made it had intended it to be. The tradition was intact, waiting to be read by anyone who had the patience and the skill to learn the ancient script and follow the careful lines of signs across the surface of the clay. The stars came out above the plain, the same stars that had watched over the antediluvian cities and the flood and the long centuries of rebuilding and the patient work of the scribes. They turned in their familiar patterns, measuring out the night in the same rhythms they had always used, indifferent to the particular moment in the long story of the world that the people below them were living through. And the tradition kept its silence, as it always had, letting the clay speak for itself to anyone who was willing to listen. The moment when the ancient tablets truly entered the modern world, when the marks pressed into clay by Babylonian and Sumerian scribes became legible again after their long silence, was not a single event but a gradual awakening, spread across decades of patient scholarly labour and punctuated by moments of sudden, startling recognition. The decipherment of cuneiform was not like the opening of a locked door, where one turn of the key floods a dark room with light. It was more like the slow brightening of a dawn, a process of increasing clarity in which shapes that had been invisible in the darkness gradually resolved into recognisable forms, and forms gradually resolved into meaning. The scholars who drove this process forward in the 19th century were a remarkable group of people, working in different countries and often in competition with each other, but united by a shared passion for recovering a world that had been lost for more than 2,000 years. They worked with inadequate tools by modern standards, their dictionaries and grammars were incomplete, their collections of texts were fragmentary and imperfectly understood, their understanding of the historical and archaeological context of the tablets was still being built from the ground up. They made mistakes, some of them significant. But they also made discoveries of extraordinary importance, and they did so with a dedication and a scholarly rigour that laid the foundation for everything that has come since. George Smith's discovery of the Gilgamesh flood narrative in 1872 was the moment when the public imagination was most dramatically captured, but it was not the only significant discovery of that era. In the years and decades that followed, scholars working with the tablets from Nineveh and from the excavations at Nippur, which began in the 1880s and produced tens of thousands of Sumerian tablets, gradually reconstructed the outlines of the antediluvian tradition in its full complexity. The Sumerian king list was identified and published, the Eridu Genesis was pieced together from fragments, the Atrahasis epic was assembled from multiple fragmentary copies, and the figure of the antediluvian world, the world before the flood, with its impossible kings and its 5 ancient cities, came into focus for the first time since the last cuneiform scribe had set down his stylus in the early centuries of the Common Era. The scholarly debates that followed these discoveries were, and to some extent remain, among the most interesting in the field of ancient Near Eastern studies. One debate that has continued with particular intensity concerns the numerical system underlying the antediluvian reigns in the king list. The numbers are large and round in a way that suggests they are not arbitrary, that they reflect some systematic principle rather than being simply invented. Several scholars have noted that the numbers can be expressed in terms of the Babylonian sexagesimal system, the base 60 system of counting that the Mesopotamians used for mathematical and astronomical calculation, and that survives in our own division of the hour into 60 minutes and the circle into 360 degrees. In the sexagesimal system, certain numbers have particular significance. They are products of the system's basic units in ways that make them mathematically elegant and easy to work with. The total of the antediluvian reigns in the Sumerian king list, when added together, comes to 241 years, a number that has specific relationships to the sexagesimal system's units. Brosses's total of 432,000 years is exactly 120 times 3,600, the Babylonian Shah. These relationships suggest that the numbers were not chosen arbitrarily, but were constructed according to a mathematical principle, possibly related to astronomical cycles that the Babylonian scholars used to organize their understanding of time. Some researchers have proposed that the enormous reigns of the antediluvian kings represent astronomical periods, the time it takes for certain planetary cycles to complete, or the length of certain cosmic ages as calculated by Babylonian astronomers. Others have suggested that the numbers encode a compressed chronology, that what was originally measured in months or seasons was later read as years, inflating the reigns by a factor of 12 or more. Still others have proposed that the numbers are purely symbolic, expressions of the idea that the antediluvian world operated in a different mode of time from the present, without any specific mathematical content. None of these interpretations has achieved universal acceptance, and the question of what the antediluvian numbers mean remains open. But the debate itself is revealing, because it shows that the tradition was not casual or careless in its construction. The people who assembled the king list and determined the reigns of the antediluvian kings were working within a sophisticated intellectual framework, one that took seriously the questions of how time was measured, how historical periods related to astronomical cycles, and how the deep past connected to the present through the orderly progression of divine-governed time. This intellectual sophistication is one of the most striking features of the Mesopotamian scribal tradition when seen as a whole. The ancient Mesopotamians were not naive mythologizers, producing simple stories to explain what they did not understand. They were systematic thinkers who applied rigorous methods to the problems they cared about, whether those problems were astronomical, mathematical, medical, or historical. Their approach to the antediluvian tradition reflected this systematic character. They preserved the tradition carefully, they compared different versions of it, they attempted to understand it in terms of the broader cosmological and mathematical frameworks they had developed, and they transmitted it to subsequent generations with the same care they gave to their astronomical tables and their mathematical problem texts. The legacy of this tradition extends, in ways that are sometimes surprising, into the modern world. The biblical flood narrative, which derives from the Mesopotamian tradition, has shaped Western religious and cultural thought for more than 2,000 years. The figure of Noah, the righteous man who survives the flood and becomes the ancestor of a renewed humanity, is one of the most deeply embedded archetypes in the Western imagination, appearing not just in religious contexts but in literature, art, philosophy, and popular culture, in an endless variety of forms. Every story of a survivor who preserves something essential through a catastrophe and carries it into a new world echoes, however distantly, the ancient Mesopotamian tradition of Ziusudra and Atrahasis and Utnapishtim. The idea of successive world ages, of civilizations that rose and fell before the present one, of a deep past in which the world was different from what it is now, has also had a long and complex afterlife in Western thought. The ancient Greek tradition preserved by Hesiod describes successive races of humanity: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron, each worse than the last, in a trajectory of decline from a primordial golden age. Plato's account of Atlantis, the advanced civilization that was swallowed by the sea, draws on the same broad tradition of a world before that was better or more powerful than the present one, destroyed by catastrophe and lost to memory. These Greek traditions may themselves reflect, however indirectly, the influence of Mesopotamian ideas transmitted through the long cultural contacts of the ancient world. In the modern era, the idea of lost antediluvian civilizations has taken on a life of its own in popular culture, inspiring a vast literature of alternative history and pseudoscience that goes far beyond anything the ancient texts actually say. Books and documentaries claiming that the antediluvian kings of the Sumerian king list represent evidence of an actual advanced civilization, sometimes described as the civilization of Atlantis, sometimes as an alien civilization, sometimes as a lost human civilization of extraordinary technological sophistication, have attracted large popular audiences while drawing sharp criticism from professional scholars. It is worth pausing here to consider why these ideas have such popular appeal and what they tell us about the human relationship to the deep past. The appeal is not difficult to understand. The idea that there was once a civilization more advanced than our own, that it was destroyed by a catastrophe, and that the memory of it survives in the ancient texts. This is a compelling narrative, one that resonates with the deep human sense that the present is not the whole story, that there is more to history than the official record acknowledges, that the past holds secrets that the mainstream has failed to recognize or has actively suppressed. These are powerful feelings, and they are not entirely without foundation. The past does hold secrets. The official historical record is incomplete. There are genuine mysteries in the ancient texts that mainstream scholarship has not fully resolved. But the specific claims of the ancient astronaut theorists and the lost civilization enthusiasts go far beyond what the evidence supports, and they do so in ways that are not merely wrong but actively misleading, that replace the genuine mystery and complexity of the ancient texts with a simpler and more exciting story that has the disadvantage of being unsupported by any actual evidence. The Sumerian king list does not say that the antediluvian kings were members of an advanced technological civilization. It does not say they were aliens. It does not say they possessed knowledge that has been lost to modern science. It says they were kings, that they ruled specific cities, and that they reigned for very long periods of time. The impossible length of their reigns is presented without elaboration or explanation in the text itself. It is simply stated as a fact of the antediluvian world, without any claim that these kings were superhuman or that their civilization was technologically advanced. The mystery of the antediluvian tradition lies not in secret knowledge or suppressed history, but in the genuine difficulty of understanding what the ancient Mesopotamians meant by what they wrote, a difficulty that is enriched, not resolved, by careful scholarship. The genuine scholarship on the antediluvian tradition is, in its own way, more interesting than any of the popular alternatives, because what the serious study of the Sumerian king list and the related texts reveals is not a conspiracy or a hidden history, but something more fundamental and more moving, a window into how one of the world's earliest civilizations understood its own place in the long arc of time, how it dealt with the problem of the deep past, how it used the resources of myth and number and careful record-keeping to construct a framework for historical consciousness that was both intellectually rigorous and emotionally resonant. The Mesopotamian scholars who compiled the king list were grappling with questions that are still live questions for us today. How far back does human history go? What came before the earliest written records? Is the civilization we inhabit the first, or have there been others? What can we know about a past that left no documents? How do we distinguish memory from myth, tradition from invention, history from story? These are not questions that ancient scholarship answered definitively, and neither has modern scholarship. But the attempt to answer them, the patient, careful, generation after generation work of preserving, transmitting, and trying to understand the record of what came before, is itself one of the most characteristically human activities there is. The tablets that carry the antediluvian tradition have now been studied for 1.5 centuries by some of the finest scholars of the ancient world. They have been translated into dozens of languages, analysed by epigraphers and historians and archaeologists and comparative mythologists, debated in academic journals and popular books and documentary films. They have been exhibited in the great museums of the world, their careful rows of cuneiform signs visible behind protective glass to anyone who cares to look. They have been digitised and made available online so that a person sitting anywhere in the world with an internet connection can look at the surface of the Weld-Blundell prism and see, in the photograph on their screen, the same marks that a Babylonian scribe pressed into wet clay nearly 4,000 years ago. And yet, for all this attention and all this analysis, the tradition they carry retains its essential mystery. We know what the texts say. We have a reasonable understanding of the language they are written in and the cultural context they emerged from. We can trace the parallels with other flood traditions and propose explanations for the impossible numbers and identify the historical cities named in the antediluvian king list. But we cannot fully know what it felt like to live in a world where this tradition was alive and present, where the memory of the world before the flood was not an archaeological curiosity, but a living part of the cultural landscape, taught in the schools and performed in the temples, and embedded in the very way people understood time and history, and the relationship between the human and the divine. That gap, between our knowledge of the texts and our understanding of the lived experience they came from, is one that no amount of scholarship can fully close. It is the gap that separates us from every civilization of the past, the gap that makes history both endlessly fascinating and fundamentally humbling. We can recover the words, we can reconstruct the context, we can trace the ideas, but the inner life of a Sumerian scribe sitting in a school in Nippur 4,000 years ago, copying the names of the antediluvian kings and feeling whatever he felt as he did so, that remains finally beyond our reach, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the gap is part of what keeps the tradition alive as a source of wonder, the sense that there is always more to understand, always a deeper layer to reach for, always something in the ancient clay that has not yet given up all its meaning. The tablets waited for 2,000 years in the darkness beneath the Mesopotamian plain, and when they were finally brought to light, they did not immediately yield all their secrets. They yielded them slowly, one careful reading at a time, over the course of a century and a half of scholarship that is still ongoing, and they will continue to yield them to the scholars of the future who will bring new questions and new methods to the ancient texts, and find in them things that previous generations had missed. The sun was moving toward the western horizon over the flat plain of southern Iraq, casting long shadows from the scattered mounds that mark the sites of the ancient cities. The light at this hour was golden and horizontal, catching the surfaces of the mud brick debris and giving them a warmth that they did not have in the harsh light of midday. The air smelled of dust and the distant sweetness of irrigated fields, the same smell it had carried for thousands of years, through all the civilizations that had risen and fallen on this plain. Somewhere beneath the surface of one of those mounds, perhaps the great mound of Nippur, still only partially excavated, still holding tens of thousands of tablets in its unexcavated layers, the record of the antediluvian world lay in the darkness, patient and permanent, carrying in its careful marks the memory of a civilization that the ancient Mesopotamians believed had existed before the flood. Whether that civilization was historical or mythological, whether the flood that ended it was a real event or a symbolic one, whether the impossible reigns of its kings encoded genuine astronomical knowledge, or were simply expressions of a different way of thinking about time. These questions remain open, and they will remain open for as long as the human mind finds them worth asking. What is not open to question is the reality of the tradition itself, the reality of the scribes who preserved it, the schools that transmitted it, the tablets that carried it forward through the centuries, and the human need that it served. The need to remember, the need to place the present in a context that extends beyond the individual lifetime and the historical period, the need to understand the world one inhabits not just as it is now, but as it has been, to reach back through the layers of time and find, in the darkness beneath the present, some trace of what came before. That need is as old as humanity itself, and it has not diminished with the passage of time. We feel it tonight as we've been following the story of the tablets and the tradition they carry, the sense that the past is not simply gone, that it persists in some form in the present, that the marks pressed into clay by a hand dead for 4,000 years still have something to say to us if we are willing to listen. The stars were coming out above the plain, one by one, in the deepening blue of the evening sky. They were the same stars that had watched over Eridu and Nippur and Ur, over the scribal schools and the temple precincts and the marketplaces of ancient Sumer, over the flood, if there was a flood, and the long rebuilding that followed, over the rise and fall of Akkad and Babylon and Assyria and all the other empires that had come and gone across the face of this ancient land. They were the same stars that the Sumerian astronomers had mapped and named and used as anchors for their understanding of time, the same stars that a student scribe might have looked up at through the window of the Aduba as he rested his eyes from the work of copying, feeling for a moment the particular vertigo of looking up into a sky that was simultaneously familiar and incomprehensibly vast. The evening settled over the mounds of the ancient cities, and the tablets rested in their darkness, and the tradition they carried moved quietly forward through the night, carried now not in clay but in the minds of the scholars who had spent their lives learning to read it, and in the books and articles and databases where their readings had been preserved, and in the minds of the people around the world who had encountered the tradition and found in it something that spoke to them across the millennia. And in the quiet of the evening, with the stars coming out one by one and the air cooling slowly around the ancient mounds, the world that the tablets described, the world before the flood, the world of the antediluvian kings, the world that had ended so completely that only the careful marks in clay preserved any memory of it, was as present as it had ever been, waiting patiently for whoever was willing to reach toward it. One careful step at a time, one careful tablet at a time, one careful reading at a time. The crisis that had been building in the ancient Mesopotamian world for generations finally broke not in a single catastrophic moment, but through a series of slow, overlapping collapses that unfolded across centuries and left the civilization that had produced the cuneiform tablets fundamentally transformed. The pressures we have already traced — environmental degradation, political fragmentation, military threat, linguistic change — did not arrive one at a time in orderly sequence. They arrived together, compounding each other, creating cascading failures in which the weakness in one part of the system amplified weaknesses in others, until the whole structure could no longer hold its original shape. The salinization of the agricultural land in the southern Mesopotamian plain continued its slow, grinding work through the 2nd millennium BCE and into the 1st, reducing the carrying capacity of the land and forcing populations to concentrate in fewer and fewer viable locations. The great cities of the south that had been the heartland of Sumerian civilization, Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, shrank from their earlier grandeur, their temple complexes still maintained but serving smaller populations, their administrative machinery simplified, their cultural production diminished. The center of gravity in Mesopotamian civilization shifted northward, to Babylon, and later to the Assyrian cities of the upper Tigris Valley, where the land was less damaged and the agricultural base more secure. This northward shift was not merely geographical, it was also linguistic and cultural. As we have seen, Akkadian had already displaced Sumerian as the primary spoken language of Mesopotamia by the early 2nd millennium BCE, but Sumerian had remained the language of religious ritual and advanced learning, maintained by the scribal schools as a classical language in much the way that Latin was maintained in medieval Europe. Through the 2nd millennium and into the 1st, even this specialized role for Sumerian gradually contracted. The number of people who could read and write Sumerian fluently declined. The scribal curriculum simplified. The great Sumerian literary compositions continued to be copied, but they were increasingly copied alongside Akkadian translations or glosses that made them accessible to students whose primary training was in Akkadian. The tradition of the antediluvian kings, embedded as it was in the Sumerian king list and in the Sumerian mythological texts, was part of this larger pattern of cultural transmission and transformation. The tradition did not die. It was too important, too deeply embedded in the Mesopotamian understanding of history and cosmology to simply disappear. But it was translated, adapted, and recontextualized for audiences whose native language and whose immediate cultural references were Akkadian rather than Sumerian. The Babylonian scribes of the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, who copied and transmitted the antediluvian tradition, were doing so in full awareness that they were preserving something from an earlier cultural moment, something that was ancient even to them, that belonged to the deep past of their own civilization. This sense of preserving an endangered tradition, of being the custodians of a heritage that was slipping away, is palpable in some of the later cuneiform texts. The colophons that scribes added to their tablets in the late Babylonian and Assyrian periods sometimes include statements about the antiquity and rarity of the texts they were copying, warnings that the tablets should be protected and not shown to the uninitiated, and expressions of pride or anxiety about the scribal lineages that had transmitted the knowledge across the generations. These colophons are not merely formulaic. They express a genuine concern that the tradition might be lost, that the knowledge carried in the tablets might not survive the pressures bearing down on the civilization that had produced them. The military and political pressures on Mesopotamian civilization in the 1st millennium BCE were severe and relentless. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which reached its greatest extent in the 7th century BCE under kings like Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, was a military state of extraordinary efficiency and brutality. Its armies conquered and held territory stretching from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia. But the empire was overstretched, its conquests too vast to be held indefinitely by the relatively small Assyrian population that provided its ruling class and military corps. And when the empire's enemies finally coordinated their efforts in the closing decades of the 7th century BCE, the collapse was swift and total. The destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE which we have already touched on, was one of the defining moments of ancient Near Eastern history. The city that had been the capital of the Assyrian Empire, the repository of Ashurbanipal's great library, and of the accumulated administrative and military machinery of the most powerful state the region had ever seen, was sacked and burned so thoroughly that it was never rebuilt. The fires that consumed the palace complex were hot enough to bake the clay tablets of the library more thoroughly than their scribes had originally fired them, preserving them against decay but also burying them under meters of collapsed mud brick and debris. The library that Ashurbanipal had assembled with such care, the tablets that recorded the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis narrative and countless other texts of the Mesopotamian literary tradition, fell silent beneath the ruins and would remain silent for more than 2,000 years. The Neo-Babylonian Empire that succeeded the Assyrians was in many ways the last flowering of the ancient Mesopotamian tradition. Under Nebuchadnezzar II and his successors, Babylon was rebuilt on a magnificent scale, with enormous fortification walls, elaborate gates decorated with glazed brick reliefs, and the restoration or expansion of the great temples of Marduk and the other gods of the Babylonian pantheon. The scribal schools of Babylon continued to function, copying and transmitting the ancient texts, maintaining the connection to the Sumerian and Akkadian literary heritage. The antediluvian tradition was still being copied and studied in this period, still being treated as an essential part of the historical and cosmological framework that made sense of the world. But the Neo-Babylonian Empire was short-lived. Less than a century after the fall of Nineveh, Babylon itself fell to the Persians under Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE. The Persian conquest was, in itself, relatively gentle. Cyrus presented himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror, claiming that the god Marduk had invited him to take power in order to restore proper religious observance that had been neglected by the last Babylonian king. The temples were not destroyed, the scribal tradition was not suppressed. The administrative machinery of Babylon was incorporated into the larger Persian Empire and continued to function much as it had before. But the Persian conquest began a process of gradual marginalization for the cuneiform scribal tradition that would, over the next several centuries, lead to its eventual extinction. The Persian Empire was a multi-ethnic, multilingual state that used Aramaic, written in an alphabetic script, as its administrative language across most of its territories. Aramaic had been spreading through the Near East for centuries, carried by merchants and scribes and migrant populations, and it had significant advantages over cuneiform as a writing system. It was simpler to learn, requiring mastery of only a few dozen letter signs rather than hundreds of cuneiform signs. It could be written quickly on papyrus or leather with ink and pen, rather than requiring the slow, careful pressing of a stylus into soft clay. And it was already widely known across the regions that the Persian Empire controlled, making it a natural choice for a common administrative language. Cuneiform did not disappear immediately with the Persian conquest. It continued to be used for religious and scholarly purposes in the temples and scribal schools of Babylon and other Mesopotamian cities for several more centuries. But its base of users was shrinking, its social function was narrowing, and the tradition it carried was increasingly the concern of a small, specialized group rather than the common heritage of an entire civilization. The scribes who maintained the tradition in the Persian, Hellenistic and Parthian periods were, in a real sense, already antiquarians. Scholars preserving a dead or dying tradition out of reverence for the past and commitment to the religious observances that required knowledge of the ancient texts. The conquest of Mesopotamia by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE brought Greek cultural influence directly into the region and accelerated the process of cultural transformation. Greek became the language of the ruling class and of high culture, overlay the existing Aramaic administrative layer, and further marginalize the cuneiform tradition. The Seleucid dynasty that ruled Mesopotamia after Alexander's death continued the pattern of the Persians. They did not actively suppress the native Mesopotamian traditions, but they did not particularly support them either, and the economic and political structures they put in place favoured Greek and Aramaic literacy over cuneiform. In this increasingly marginal context, the scribes who continued to copy the cuneiform tablets were engaged in what they must have understood, at some level, as a rearguard action against oblivion. They were preserving a tradition that was no longer central to the functioning of their society, that was no longer being taught to the majority of educated people, that was becoming, with each generation, more distant and more difficult to sustain, and yet they continued. They continued to copy the astronomical tablets, the omen texts, the mythological compositions, the historical records. They continued to transmit the antediluvian tradition, the names of the kings before the flood, the cities they had ruled, the impossible lengths of their reigns, because that tradition was part of what it meant to be a cuneiform scribe, part of the heritage they had inherited and were responsible for passing on. The last dated cuneiform tablets come from the 1st century of the Common Era. They are astronomical texts from Babylon and Uruk, recording observations of planetary positions and lunar eclipses in the familiar script and format that had been used for such records for more than a millennium. The scribes who made these tablets were specialists, astronomer priests attached to the temples, carrying out observational work that had both practical and religious significance. They were among the last people in the world who could read and write cuneiform fluently, the final living links to a tradition that stretched back more than 3,000 years. When they died, and we do not know their names, or exactly when they died, or what became of their tablets in the immediate aftermath, the knowledge of cuneiform died with them. There was no great moment of destruction, no dramatic burning of libraries, no deliberate suppression. There was simply a quiet fading, as the last few people who possessed the skill stopped practicing it, stopped teaching it to the next generation, stopped maintaining the tradition that had sustained their predecessors for so many centuries. The script that had recorded the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Sumerian king list, and the astronomical observations of Babylonian scholars fell silent, and the tablets that carried all this knowledge slipped beneath the surface of memory and became, for a very long time, merely curious objects, bits of inscribed clay whose marks no one could read and whose meaning no one could recover. The temples that had housed the tablets gradually fell into disrepair. The cities themselves, Babylon, Uruk, Nippur, the others, declined in population and importance, their inhabitants moving away to newer settlements or dispersed across the countryside. The mud brick buildings collapsed in the rain and the wind, their walls melting back into the earth from which they had been made. The tablets, protected by the very collapse of the structures that had housed them, were buried beneath layers of debris, sealed away in the darkness, preserved by clay's extraordinary durability against everything except moisture and mechanical destruction. And there they waited, through the late Roman period and the rise of Christianity, through the Islamic conquest of Mesopotamia in the 7th century CE, and the construction of Baghdad as the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, through the Mongol invasions of the 13th century and the eventual incorporation of Mesopotamia into the Ottoman Empire. Through all these transformations of the region's political and cultural landscape, the tablets lay in the earth, carrying their cargo of forgotten knowledge, waiting for a time when someone would have the skill and the interest and the scholarly apparatus necessary to recover what they said. The mounds that covered the ancient cities became part of the landscape, familiar features to the people who lived near them, sometimes quarried for building material, sometimes avoided as places haunted by jinn or troubled spirits, sometimes climbed by children at play or by travellers seeking a view across the flat plain. The tablets turned up occasionally in the course of agricultural work or construction, strange objects whose purpose was not understood, sometimes discarded, sometimes kept as curiosities, sometimes ground up and used as temper in pottery or as grit for various purposes. The knowledge they carried remained inaccessible, locked away not by any physical barrier, but by the simple fact that no one alive could read the script in which it was written. This long sleep of the cuneiform tradition, 2,000 years from the death of the last scribe to the beginning of modern decipherment, is one of the most remarkable aspects of the story we have been following tonight. For 2 millennia, the antediluvian tradition existed only as marks on clay, silent and unreadable, while the world above the tablets forgot completely that the tradition had ever existed. The biblical flood narrative, which derived ultimately from the same Mesopotamian source, continued to be read and copied and studied throughout this period, shaping the religious imagination of Judaism and Christianity and Islam. But the connection between the biblical narrative and its Mesopotamian antecedents was completely lost. The Sumerian king list and the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis narrative lay in the darkness beneath the mounds of Iraq, and no one in the medieval world knew they were there. This forgetting was complete in a way that is difficult for us, living in an age of historical consciousness and preserved records to fully appreciate. It was not merely that people in medieval Mesopotamia did not know the details of Sumerian mythology, it was that they did not know there had ever been a Sumerian language or a Sumerian civilization. They did not know that the mounds scattered across the Iraqi plain were the remains of ancient cities. They did not know that cuneiform writing had ever existed. The entire civilization that had produced the tablets had been so thoroughly forgotten that when European travellers began to visit the region in the early modern period and ask what the mounds were, the local inhabitants could offer only vague legends that they were the remains of ancient cities perhaps, or the work of giants or supernatural beings from the time before the Islamic era. This total erasure of a civilization from active memory, despite the physical survival of millions of artifacts from that civilization, is a sobering reminder of how fragile cultural transmission can be. The Mesopotamian scribal tradition had seemed so robust, so carefully institutionalized, so thoroughly embedded in the social and religious fabric of its civilization that it is difficult to imagine how it could simply stop. And yet it did. The temples that had supported the scribes closed or were converted to other purposes. The scribal schools that had trained each generation of students ceased to function. The economic and political structures that had made literacy valuable collapsed or transformed into forms that favoured different kinds of literacy. And within a few generations the living knowledge was gone, preserved only in the silent tablets buried beneath the earth. But the tablets did preserve it. That is the crucial fact. The knowledge was not lost permanently. It was only sleeping, locked away in a medium so durable that it could survive 2,000 years of burial and still be read when the conditions were right. The clay that the ancient scribes had chosen as their writing medium, precisely because of its abundance and its permanence, proved to be capable of carrying their words across a chasm of time that no other ancient medium could have crossed. Papyrus would have rotted, leather would have decayed, wood would have turned to dust. But the clay remained, hard and permanent, waiting with the infinite patience of the inanimate for someone to reach down and lift it back into the light. The rediscovery of that knowledge in the 19th and 20th centuries, which we have already touched on, was not merely a scholarly achievement. It was a kind of resurrection, the bringing back to life of a civilization that had been completely dead to human memory for 2 millennia. The tablets that George Smith and his colleagues decoded in the British Museum were not just sources of information about the ancient past. They were voices speaking directly from that past, carrying the words and thoughts and concerns of people who had lived and died thousands of years ago, preserved with such fidelity that a modern scholar could read them and understand, with reasonable confidence, what they meant. This fidelity of preservation is what makes the cuneiform tablets such extraordinary historical sources. Unlike texts that have been copied and recopied through chains of manuscript transmission, each copying introducing the possibility of error or alteration, the cuneiform tablets are original documents created by the hands of ancient scribes and left unchanged from that moment to this. When we read the Sumerian king list on the Weld-Blundell prism, we are reading exactly what an ancient scribe wrote. The same words, in the same order, with the same orthography, preserved in the same physical object that he created. There is no textual transmission to worry about, no manuscript tradition to reconstruct. The text is simply there, direct and immediate, as close to the ancient author's intention as we can ever hope to get. This directness gives the tablets a kind of emotional power that goes beyond their scholarly value. When you stand in front of a cuneiform tablet in a museum and look at the surface covered with tiny wedge-shaped marks, you're looking at an object that was held and created by a human being in the ancient world. A person who pressed the marks into the wet clay with his own hand, who made the decisions about what to write and how to write it, who finished the tablet and set it aside to dry in exactly the form in which you're seeing it now. The connection across time is almost tangible. The gap of thousands of years collapses into the immediate presence of the object, and the ancient world feels for a moment not distant and abstract but real and close. The scholars who have devoted their careers to reading and interpreting the cuneiform tablets are, in a sense, the heirs of the ancient scribal tradition. The people who have taken up the work of transmission and preservation that the last cuneiform scribes were forced to abandon. They have learned the ancient languages, mastered the script, built the dictionaries and grammars and reference works that make the tablets accessible to a wider audience. They have connected the tablets to their archaeological contexts, traced the development of the scribal tradition across the centuries, and worked out the relationships between different texts and different versions of the same tradition. They have done all this with a rigour and a dedication that the ancient scribes would, one likes to think, recognise and appreciate. The same patient, careful, generation after generation work of preserving knowledge and passing it on. And through this work, the antediluvian tradition has returned to active life, not as a living religious belief, not as a framework for historical consciousness in the way it was for the ancient Mesopotamians, but as a source of knowledge about the human past, about how one civilization understood its own origins, about how myth and history intersected in the ancient world, about the deep human need to reach back before the beginning of recorded memory and imagine what came before. The tradition speaks to us differently than it spoke to the ancient scribes who copied it in Nippur and Babylon. We do not believe, in any literal sense, that there were kings before the flood who reigned for tens of thousands of years. We do not see the flood as a historical event that marked a clear division between one world and another. We do not treat the Sumerian king list as a source of chronological data about the remote past, but we do recognize in the tradition something that still resonates: the sense that the world has a deep history, that there have been things before, that the present is built on layers of past that extend far beyond what we can directly remember or document. This sense has, if anything, become stronger and more vivid in the modern era as archaeology and paleontology and geology have pushed back the timeline of human history and prehistory far beyond what the ancients could have imagined. We now know that there were indeed humans living in Mesopotamia long before the first cities, hunter-gatherers and early farmers whose lives left only the faintest traces in the archaeological record. We know that there were ice ages and climate shifts that transformed the landscape and forced human populations to adapt or move. We know that sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, flooding coastal areas and river valleys and creating the kind of landscape transformations that could, in the memory of the survivors, have become stories of a great flood. None of this validates the literal content of the Sumerian king list, but it does suggest that the ancient Mesopotamian intuition that there was a world before different from the present that ended and was replaced by something new was not entirely wrong. The world does have that kind of deep history. There were earlier phases of human life in Mesopotamia, and they were indeed ended by environmental and climatic changes, and the civilization that emerged after those changes was different from what had come before. The antediluvian tradition, seen in this light, is not a factual record, but it is also not mere fantasy. It is a mythologized memory of real transformations, shaped and elaborated by the cosmological and literary frameworks of the people who transmitted it, but preserving at its core an intuition about the deep past that modern scholarship has confirmed in its broad outlines. This recognition that myth can carry genuine historical information, that tradition can preserve memory across immense spans of time, that the stories people tell about their origins have roots in real experience even when the specific details are not literally true, is one of the important insights of modern archaeology and anthropology. It suggests a more nuanced relationship between history and myth than the simple opposition that earlier generations of scholars assumed. History and myth are not separate domains. They are different ways of organizing and transmitting knowledge about the past, and they can coexist, overlap, and inform each other in complex ways. The Sumerian king list is a perfect example of this complex relationship. It contains mythological material, the antediluvian kings with their impossible reigns. It contains legendary material, the early dynastic kings whose existence is possible but not well documented. And it contains historical material, the later kings whose reigns can be verified from other sources and fit into a clear chronological framework. These different kinds of material are not presented separately in the text. They flow into each other without clear boundaries, forming a single continuous narrative that treats the remote mythological past and the recent historical past as parts of the same story. This continuity was deliberate. The compilers of the king list were not confused about the difference between myth and history. They were making a claim about the nature of kingship, that it was a single institution, divinely ordained, continuous from the beginning of the world to the present, connecting the current rulers to the deep past and the cosmic order. The mythological kings were part of this claim. They anchored the institution in a past that was older than memory, that belonged to the time when the gods and humans were closer, when the world operated according to different principles. and by including them in the same list with the historical kings, the compilers were asserting that the historical kings participated in that same divine order, that they were not merely political rulers, but cosmic figures whose authority derived from the same source as the antediluvian kings. This use of myth for political purposes is something we can observe in many ancient cultures, and it is not in itself surprising. What is remarkable about the Mesopotamian tradition is the sophistication with which it was done. The careful construction of the king list as a document that could serve both scholarly and political purposes, that could be read as history or as myth, or as something between the two depending on what the reader brought to it. The tradition was flexible enough to accommodate different interpretations, while maintaining its essential structure and its core claims, and it was durable enough to survive not just the fall of individual dynasties but the complete collapse of the civilization that had produced it. The tablets that carried the tradition lay in the earth through 2,000 years of forgetting, and when they were finally read again, the tradition they preserved was still coherent, still meaningful, still capable of speaking to people living in a completely different world. That durability is testament to the care with which the tradition was constructed and the medium in which it was preserved. The patient work of scribes and the permanent solidity of clay, working together to carry knowledge across the vast gulf of time. The sun was setting over the museum in London where the tablets from Nineveh rested in their climate-controlled cases, protected now not by burial in the earth, but by the careful stewardship of modern conservation. The light coming through the windows was fading, and the guards were beginning to move through the galleries, gently letting the last visitors know that closing time was approaching. Outside, the city was settling into its evening rhythms. The rush of traffic, the crowds on the sidewalks, the lights coming on in the windows of buildings that stretched in every direction as far as the eye could see. Inside the museum, in the dim light of the closing galleries, the tablets sat silent on their shelves, their surfaces covered with the tiny wedge-shaped marks that had been pressed into them by Assyrian scribes nearly 3,000 years ago. The marks were as clear as the day they were made. The clay was as hard as it had been when the burning palace collapsed around it. The words were still there, still readable, still carrying the memory of the world before the flood and the kings who had ruled in that ancient time. And somewhere in the world, perhaps in that very moment, a scholar was sitting at a desk with a photograph of one of those tablets on a screen in front of them, carefully working through the cuneiform signs, passing the grammar, checking the dictionary, building up slowly and patiently an understanding of what the ancient scribe had meant. Doing the same work, in essence, that the scribes of Nippur had done when they copied the king list 4,000 years ago. The work of transmission, of preservation, of carrying knowledge forward from one generation to the next. The tradition was still moving, the tablets were still speaking, and the memory of the world before the flood was still alive, passed from clay to mind to book, to screen to mind again, in an unbroken chain of transmission that connected the present moment to the deep past through the patient. Careful, endlessly repeated work of reading and copying and understanding and passing on. One sign at a time, one word at a time, one tablet at a time, the work continues. The end of the antediluvian tradition as a living framework for understanding history came not with a single moment of destruction, but through the gradual exhaustion of the institutions and practices that had sustained it for so long. The temples of Babylon and Uruk that had housed the last cuneiform scribes were not burned or sacked in some dramatic final catastrophe. They simply declined, their revenues diminished, their staffs reduced, their activities curtailed, until at some point in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, they ceased to function as centres of learning and became merely archaeological sites waiting to be buried by time. The world that replaced the cuneiform tradition was not a world without literacy or learning. It was a world with different literacies, different institutions, different ways of organising and transmitting knowledge. Aramaic, written in its alphabetic script, had become the dominant written language of the region by the time of Christ, and it served the practical needs of commerce, administration, and record-keeping more efficiently than cuneiform ever could. Greek, carried into the region by Alexander's conquest and maintained by the Seleucid dynasty that succeeded him, became the language of philosophy, science, and high culture for those educated in the Hellenistic tradition. And as Christianity and later Islam spread through Mesopotamia, new religious literatures in Syriac and Arabic created new frameworks for understanding the past and the divine order. These new traditions did not preserve the antediluvian tradition in its original form. The cuneiform tablets that recorded the Sumerian king list and the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis narrative were not translated into Aramaic or Greek or Syriac or Arabic. The specific content of the Mesopotamian flood tradition, the names of the antediluvian kings, the impossible lengths of their reigns, the 5 cities that had held kingship before the flood, was simply lost to active memory when the last cuneiform scribes died. What survived was only the broader narrative framework, the idea of a great flood that had destroyed an earlier world, and even that survived only in transformed versions, filtered through the biblical tradition and the commentaries and elaborations that tradition had accumulated. The biblical book of Genesis, which had been composed in Hebrew in the 1st millennium BCE and which drew on Mesopotamian sources either directly or through common ancient Near Eastern traditions, preserved a version of the flood story that was recognizably related to the Mesopotamian original, but also significantly different from it. The biblical flood was sent by a single god as punishment for human wickedness, not by a council of gods responding to human noise. The survivor was Noah, a righteous man chosen for his virtue, not Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, pious kings warned by sympathetic deities. The flood lasted 40 days and 40 nights, not the 7 days and 7 nights of the Gilgamesh version. And the world that emerged after the flood was presented as a fresh start for all humanity, not as a restoration of kingship descended from heaven to specific Mesopotamian cities. These differences are not trivial. They reflect genuine theological and narrative divergences between the biblical and Mesopotamian traditions, divergences that have important implications for how each tradition understands the relationship between God and humanity, the nature of divine justice, and the meaning of catastrophe and renewal. But the similarities are also striking enough to make clear that the two traditions are related, that they are drawing on a common source or that one is influenced by the other. And when George Smith announced his discovery of the Gilgamesh flood narrative in 1872, the scholarly and religious world was forced to confront the reality that the biblical story, which had been understood as a unique divine revelation, had clear parallels in a pagan tradition that predated it by more than a millennium. The reaction to this discovery was complex and in some quarters deeply troubled. For believers in the literal truth and unique divine origin of the Bible, the existence of an older Mesopotamian flood narrative posed a serious challenge. If the biblical authors had borrowed the flood story from Babylonian sources, what did that say about the status of the Bible as revelation? If the story was not unique to the biblical tradition, how could it be understood as a special communication from God to his chosen people? These questions could not be easily answered, and they generated intense debate in both scholarly and religious circles that continued for decades. Some responded to the challenge by arguing that the Mesopotamian tradition was itself derived from a common human memory of a real historical flood, that Noah and Utnapishtim were different names for the same historical figure, and that both the biblical and Mesopotamian traditions were preserving in their different ways a true account of an actual event. This position had the advantage of preserving the historical core of the biblical narrative while acknowledging the reality of the Mesopotamian parallel. But it required accepting that the biblical account was not the only, or even necessarily the most accurate version of the story, which many believers found difficult. Others argued that the direction of influence had been misunderstood, that the Mesopotamian tradition had actually borrowed from an earlier Hebrew or Semitic tradition that was the true original. This position was harder to defend on purely historical grounds, given the clear evidence that the Mesopotamian tablets predated the biblical text by many centuries, but it was maintained by some scholars who were committed to defending the priority and originality of the biblical tradition. Still others accepted that the biblical tradition had indeed drawn on Mesopotamian sources, but argued that this did not diminish the theological significance of the biblical text. The biblical authors had taken the Mesopotamian story and transformed it, infusing it with a new monotheistic theology that made it a vehicle for profound truths about the nature of God and the human condition. The value of the biblical text lay not in its historical originality, but in its theological depth and its ethical vision. This position, which came to be broadly accepted in more liberal Christian and Jewish circles, allowed for both respect for the Mesopotamian tradition and continued reverence for the biblical text, while acknowledging the complex historical relationship between them. The debate over the relationship between the biblical and Mesopotamian flood narratives was, in some ways, a microcosm of the larger transformation in how the Western world understood the Bible and its relationship to the ancient Near East. Before the decipherment of cuneiform, the Bible had been understood as a text that stood apart from its ancient context, a unique divine revelation given to a chosen people, whose truth and authority did not depend on any external confirmation or comparison. After the decipherment, it became clear that the Bible was deeply embedded in the culture and literature of the ancient Near East, that its authors had drawn on Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Canaanite sources, and that many of its most distinctive stories and themes had parallels or precedents in the surrounding cultures. This realization did not destroy the Bible's religious authority for most believers. Religious truth and historical truth are different kinds of truth, and a text can be theologically profound even if its historical claims are complicated or contested. But it did change the way the Bible was studied and understood, making it an object of historical and comparative scholarship rather than merely an object of faith. And it opened up new and productive ways of reading the biblical text, not as a timeless revelation dropped from heaven, but as a complex literary and theological response to the world in which it was created, shaped by that world even as it sought to transform it. The antediluvian tradition, seen from this perspective, is not just an interesting parallel to the biblical flood story. It is a window into the broader cultural world from which the Bible emerged, a world in which stories of creation and flood and divine human interaction circulated widely, were told and retold in different languages and different cultures, and were constantly being adapted and transformed to serve new purposes. The Sumerian king list and the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis narrative are not curiosities or footnotes to biblical history. They are major works of ancient literature in their own right, products of a sophisticated civilization that was grappling with the same fundamental questions about origins and meaning and catastrophe that the biblical authors would later grapple with in their own way. Understanding this larger context enriches rather than diminishes our appreciation of both traditions. The Mesopotamian tradition becomes more interesting when we see it not as a primitive precursor to the Bible, but as an independent and sophisticated intellectual achievement. And the biblical tradition becomes more interesting when we see it not as a bolt from the blue, but as a creative transformation of existing materials shaped by specific theological insights and ethical commitments that made it something genuinely new, even as it drew on older sources. The aftermath of the cuneiform tradition's extinction was, for the tablets themselves, a long period of silent preservation beneath the earth. The mounds of Mesopotamia slowly grew as new settlements were built on the ruins of old ones, and the debris of collapsed buildings accumulated over the centuries. The tablets were buried deeper and deeper, protected from the elements by the very weight of the earth that covered them, waiting in darkness for a future that the scribes who had created them could not have imagined. That future began to arrive in the 19th century, when European archaeologists started to excavate the mounds in a systematic way and discovered the vast quantities of tablets they contained. The excavations at Nineveh by Layard and his successors produced tens of thousands of tablets from Ashurbanipal's library. The excavations at Nippur, conducted by the University of Pennsylvania beginning in 1889, produced even more, eventually more than 50,000 tablets and fragments, making Nippur one of the richest sources of Sumerian literary texts ever discovered. The excavations at Ur by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s uncovered not just tablets, but the spectacular royal tombs of the 3rd millennium BCE, with their extraordinary grave goods and their evidence of elaborate burial rituals. These excavations transformed the study of ancient Mesopotamia from a field based primarily on biblical references and classical sources to one grounded in the direct material evidence of the civilization itself. The tablets that emerged from the excavations were primary sources, actual documents created by the ancient Mesopotamians for their own purposes, not filtered through the perspectives and prejudices of later writers. And as these tablets were catalogued, translated, and analysed, they revealed a civilization of extraordinary complexity and sophistication, with a rich literary tradition, advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge, complex legal and administrative systems, and profound theological and philosophical reflections on the nature of the divine and the human condition. The antediluvian tradition was just one thread in this much larger tapestry, but it was an important one. It appeared not just in the Sumerian king list, but in multiple mythological texts, in astronomical and chronological calculations, in scribal exercises and scholarly commentaries. It was woven into the fundamental framework through which the Mesopotamians understood their own history and their place in the cosmic order. And the recovery of this tradition, through the patient work of decipherment and interpretation, gave modern scholars access to a way of thinking about time and history that was profoundly different from modern Western assumptions, but also strikingly sophisticated in its own terms. One of the most important insights that emerged from the study of the antediluvian tradition was the recognition that the ancient Mesopotamians had developed what we might call a deep time perspective, an understanding that the world had a history extending far back before the beginning of written records, and that this deep history was significant and worth preserving even if its details could not be known with certainty. The antediluvian kings, with their impossible reigns, were, in this sense, placeholders for a past that was too old to be remembered accurately, but too important to be forgotten entirely. They marked out a space in the historical consciousness for the time before, the world that had existed and then ended, the civilizations that had risen and fallen before the present one. This deep time perspective was not unique to Mesopotamia. We find similar ideas in other ancient cultures, as we have noted. But the Mesopotamian version was distinctive in its attempt to integrate the deep past with the historical present through the framework of the king list, creating a single continuous chronology that linked the present rulers to the very beginning of the world. This integration was partly political. It served to legitimate the authority of current kings by connecting them to an ancient and divinely ordained institution. But it was also intellectual. It reflected a genuine attempt to understand the relationship between myth and history, between the knowable past of written records and the unknowable past that lay before them. Modern scholarship has developed its own deep time perspective, one based not on mythological traditions but on scientific methods, radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic analysis, the study of ancient DNA and climate proxies. This scientific deep time extends much further back than anything the ancient Mesopotamians imagined. Not just thousands of years, but millions, ultimately billions. We now know that the human species is hundreds of thousands of years old, that anatomically modern humans emerged in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago, that the first settlements in Mesopotamia date back only about 12,000 years, and that the first cities emerged only about 6,000 years ago. The entire span of Mesopotamian civilization, from the first farmers to the last cuneiform scribes, is a tiny sliver of human history, which is itself a tiny sliver of the history of life on Earth. This scientific perspective makes the antediluvian tradition seem, in one sense, quaint, a primitive attempt to grasp at timescales that modern science has far exceeded. But in another sense, the scientific perspective confirms the intuition that drove the antediluvian tradition, that the world has a deep history, that there were earlier phases of human life that were different from the present, that the civilization we inhabit is not the first and not the only way humans have organized their lives. The specifics are different. The antediluvian kings are mythological, not historical, but the underlying insight is sound, and there is something else that the antediluvian tradition captures that pure scientific chronology does not. The emotional and existential weight of deep time, the sense of vertigo that comes from contemplating the vast span of the past and the contingency of the present. The Mesopotamians who copied the king list and told stories about the flood were not just recording dry chronological data. They were grappling with profound questions about meaning and continuity and loss. What does it mean that the world before was swept away? What does it mean that we live in a world that has been rebuilt after catastrophe? What does it mean that the past is so deep and so dark that we can barely see into it, that our knowledge fades into myth, and myth fades into silence? These are not just ancient questions. They are perennial human questions, questions that each generation must answer for itself in terms that make sense in its own context. The Mesopotamian answer, that the world has cycles of rise and fall, that catastrophe is followed by renewal, that the gods oversee a process larger than any individual human life or any individual civilization, is not our answer. But it is a serious and sophisticated answer, one that took seriously both the reality of catastrophic change and the possibility of continuity and recovery. The tablets that carried this answer waited in the earth for 2,000 years, their knowledge locked away but not lost, preserved in clay until the right conditions emerged for their recovery. And when they were finally read again, In the libraries and museums and universities of the modern world, they did not just provide information about the ancient past. They provided something more valuable, a different perspective on time and history and the human condition, a way of thinking that had been lost and then recovered, that could be set alongside modern ways of thinking and illuminate them from an unexpected angle. This is perhaps the deepest significance of the antediluvian tradition and of the broader cuneiform tradition it belongs to. It is not just a source of historical data, though it is certainly that. It is a voice from a radically different time and place, speaking about concerns that are both deeply foreign and strangely familiar, reminding us that the assumptions we take for granted about time and history and the relationship between past and present are not universal or inevitable, but are shaped by our particular cultural moment. The Mesopotamians saw the world differently than we do, and recovering their perspective, even partially, even imperfectly, expands our understanding of what it means to be human and to live in time. The sun had long since set over the mounds of ancient Mesopotamia, and the stars were brilliant in the desert sky. The same stars that Sumerian astronomers had mapped 4,000 years ago, the same stars that had turned overhead while the tablets were being pressed and dried and stored away in temple libraries, the same stars that had continued their patient rotation while the tablets lay buried and forgotten. The mounds were dark and silent in the night, their surfaces cool now after the heat of the day, their shapes barely visible against the darker sky. Somewhere beneath those mounds, still unexcavated, still waiting in the darkness, were more tablets. Thousands of them, perhaps tens of thousands, recording texts that no modern scholar had yet read, preserving knowledge and stories and calculations and prayers that had not been seen by human eyes since the ancient scribes who created them set them aside. The earth held them patiently, as it had always done, protecting them from the passage of time while the world above changed and changed again. And in the museums and libraries and universities where the excavated tablets had found their new homes, scholars were still at work, cataloguing, conserving, translating, interpreting, trying to understand more fully and more accurately what the ancient texts said and what they meant. New technologies were being brought to bear on old problems. Digital imaging that could make visible signs too faint for the eye to see, computer databases that could search thousands of texts for particular words or phrases, statistical methods that could identify patterns in large bodies of data. The work of recovering the ancient world was ongoing, never finished, always revealing new layers of complexity and meaning. The antediluvian tradition, preserved in tablets scattered across museums on several continents, was now accessible not just to specialists but to anyone with an internet connection and the willingness to engage with translations and scholarly discussions. The Weld-Blundell prism could be viewed in high-resolution photographs on the Ashmolean Museum's website. The Gilgamesh tablets from Nineveh could be examined in the British Museum's online collection. Translations of the major texts were available in multiple languages, with scholarly commentaries explaining the context and the interpretive challenges. The tradition that had been locked away in darkness for 2 millennia was now more widely available than it had ever been, even in its own time. This democratization of access to the ancient texts is one of the quiet revolutions of the digital age, and it has implications that we're only beginning to understand. For most of human history, knowledge of the past has been guarded by specialists. Scribes who controlled the skill of writing, priests who controlled access to sacred texts, scholars who controlled the tools of interpretation. The cuneiform tradition was built on exactly this kind of controlled access. The scribal schools that trained students in the difficult art of reading and writing cuneiform, the temple libraries that housed the tablets and restricted who could consult them, the lineages of scholarship that passed knowledge from master to student across the generations. The modern scholarly tradition that recovered cuneiform knowledge in the 19th and 20th centuries initially reproduced some of this gatekeeping. The tablets were in museums and libraries that required special access. The skill of reading cuneiform was difficult and required years of training. The publications where the texts were translated and discussed were expensive and available only in research libraries. But the digital revolution has broken down many of these barriers. The tablets are being digitized and made available online. Translations are being published in open access formats. Tools for learning cuneiform are being created and shared freely. The knowledge that was once the province of a small group of specialists is becoming, gradually, part of the common heritage of anyone interested in the ancient world. This transformation is not without its challenges. Wider access can mean superficial engagement, people encountering ancient texts without the background knowledge necessary to understand them properly, drawing hasty conclusions, spreading misconceptions. The rise of pseudoscientific theories about ancient astronauts and lost advanced civilizations is partly a product of this wider but shallower access. People read about the Sumerian king list, or see images of cuneiform tablets, and construct elaborate theories based on misunderstandings and wishful thinking, without doing the hard work of learning the languages and the context that would allow them to understand what the texts actually say. But the answer to these challenges is not to restrict access again. It is to do better at public education, at making the real scholarship accessible and engaging, at showing that the actual ancient world revealed by careful study is far more interesting than any of the fantasies that people construct in ignorance. The work of scholars like Irving Finkel, who has spent decades making cuneiform texts accessible to general audiences through books, lectures, and media appearances, demonstrates that it is possible to maintain scholarly rigor while communicating effectively with non-specialists. The ancient world does not need to be dumbed down to be made interesting. It needs to be presented clearly and vividly, with respect for both the complexity of the material and the intelligence of the audience. The antediluvian tradition is a perfect case in point. The real tradition, the Sumerian king list with its careful structure and its integration of myth and history, the flood narratives with their theological depth and their literary sophistication, the scholarly commentaries with their attempts to understand and reconcile different versions, is far more interesting than the fantasy of ancient astronauts or lost super-civilizations. It is interesting precisely because it is complex and ambiguous, because it resists easy interpretation, because it forces us to grapple with difficult questions about the relationship between myth and history and the ways that cultures remember and transmit their past. This complexity is not a bug, but a feature. It is what makes the tradition worth studying, worth preserving, worth thinking about. And it is what makes the recovery of the cuneiform tablets one of the great intellectual achievements of the modern era. Not because it answered all our questions about the ancient world, but because it opened up new questions that we are still working through, questions that will continue to be productive for as long as people care about the deep past and the long arc of human civilization. The legacy of the antediluvian tradition extends into the present not as a living belief but as a recovered memory, a window into how one of humanity's earliest civilizations understood the relationship between past and present, between myth and history, between the human world and the divine order that was believed to govern it. The tablets that preserve this tradition are now scattered across museums and collections around the world. Their journeys from the ancient scribal schools of Nippur and Babylon to their current homes in London, Oxford, Philadelphia, Istanbul, Baghdad, and elsewhere, forming a complex web of archaeological discovery, colonial acquisition, scholarly exchange, and cultural heritage politics. The question of where these tablets belong, whether they should remain in the Western museums that have housed them for more than a century or be returned to Iraq, the modern nation that occupies the land where they were created, is not a simple one, and it touches on deep issues of cultural ownership, historical responsibility, and the ethics of archaeological practice. The tablets were excavated at a time when the Ottoman Empire and later the British and French colonial authorities controlled Iraq, and the legal frameworks that governed their export were created by those authorities without input from the local population. Many Iraqis, looking at the enormous collections of cuneiform tablets in Western museums, see cultural patrimony that was taken from their land and should be returned. Many Western curators and scholars, looking at the same collections, see cultural heritage that belongs to all humanity and that has been preserved and made accessible through Western scholarship in ways that would not have been possible if the tablets had remained in Iraq. Both perspectives have validity, and the tension between them reflects larger questions about who owns the past and how the material remains of ancient civilization should be cared for and interpreted. The destruction of Iraqi cultural heritage by looters and by ISIS militants in recent decades has given new urgency to these questions, demonstrating that preservation is not just a matter of principle, but of practical protection against the very real threats that archaeological sites and museum collections face in regions of conflict and instability. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad, which houses the largest collection of cuneiform tablets that remain in their country of origin, was devastated by looting and the chaos that followed the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Thousands of objects were stolen, many of them never recovered. Archaeological sites across Iraq were looted on a massive scale in the same period, with entire tells being excavated illegally and their contents sold on the black market to collectors around the world. The ancient city of Nimrud, which Layard had excavated in the 1840s and which still contained enormous amounts of unexcavated material, was bulldozed by ISIS in 2015 in a deliberate act of cultural destruction. These events represent losses that can never be recovered, knowledge destroyed before it could be recorded, connections between objects and their contexts severed permanently. In this context, the preservation of cuneiform tablets in museums around the world takes on a different significance. The tablets in London and Philadelphia and Paris are safe from looting and destruction, in ways that tablets in Iraq might not be, at least under current conditions. They are accessible to scholars from around the world who can study them without having to travel to conflict zones. They are part of public collections that serve educational missions and that reach audiences who might never have the opportunity to visit Iraq. The colonial history of how they were acquired is troubling and deserves to be acknowledged and grappled with, but the fact of their preservation and accessibility is valuable and should not be dismissed. At the same time, the concentration of Mesopotamian cultural heritage in Western institutions does represent a real loss for Iraq and for the Iraqi people, who have been deprived of direct access to a crucial part of their own history. The return of at least some portion of these collections, when conditions allow for their safe preservation and display in Iraq, would be an act of historical justice and a recognition that the people who live on the land where these objects were created have a special relationship to them that goes beyond the universal claims of shared human heritage. These are not questions with easy answers, and they will continue to be debated and negotiated in the years ahead as international norms around cultural property continue to evolve. What is clear is that the tablets themselves, the physical objects that carry the antediluvian tradition and so much else, are finite and irreplaceable, that their preservation is a responsibility that transcends national boundaries and political disputes, and that the knowledge they contain is genuinely part of the shared heritage of humanity, even as particular communities have particular claims on and relationships to them. The modern descendants of the ancient Mesopotamians are not a clearly defined group. The population of modern Iraq is ethnically and religiously diverse, including Arabs, Kurds, Assyrians, Turkmen and others, with complex histories of migration and mixing that make any simple claim of descent from the ancient Sumerians or Babylonians impossible to sustain. The languages spoken in modern Iraq, Arabic, Kurdish, Turkmen, Neo-Aramaic, are not descended from Sumerian or Akkadian, though Arabic and Neo-Aramaic are Semitic languages related to the Akkadian that was spoken in ancient Mesopotamia. The Assyrian Christian communities of northern Iraq and the diaspora do maintain a strong cultural identification with the ancient Assyrians, and their Neo-Aramaic dialects preserve some continuity with the Aramaic that was spoken in the region in antiquity. This identification is not purely symbolic. There is genuine historical and linguistic continuity, even though the religious and cultural framework has been transformed by 2,000 years of Christianity. But the Assyrian Christians are a small minority in modern Iraq, and their claims to special connection with the ancient past coexist with the broader Iraqi national narrative that sees all of ancient Mesopotamian civilization as part of Iraq's heritage. What is true for all the people of modern Iraq, regardless of their ethnic or religious identity, is that they live on a landscape saturated with the remains of the ancient civilizations that created the cuneiform tablets. The mounds are still there, still holding their contents, still part of the daily visual landscape for anyone living in or travelling through the region. The rivers that made Mesopotamian civilization possible are still there, though they have shifted their courses and are now threatened by upstream damming and climate change. The fundamental geography that shaped ancient life, the flat plain, the seasonal floods, the relationship between the agricultural lowlands and the pastoral highlands, is still recognisable, even though the modern economy and infrastructure have transformed how people interact with that geography. This continuity of landscape is one way in which the ancient past remains present in Iraq, in a way that it does not in the Western museums where so many of the tablets are housed. You can stand on the mound of ancient Nippur and look out across the plain and see something very much like what a Sumerian scribe would have seen 4,000 years ago. The same horizontal landscape, the same quality of light, the same sense of vast space and enormous sky. You cannot have that experience in a museum gallery in London or Philadelphia. The tablets there are preserved and accessible, but they are also removed from the context that gave them meaning, placed in a controlled environment that protects them but also isolates them from the world they came from. This tension between preservation and context is fundamental to museum practice, and it affects how we experience and understand ancient objects. The Well-Blundell Prism in its climate-controlled case in Oxford is far better preserved than it would be if it had remained in Iraq, exposed to the elements and the risks of looting and destruction, but it is also, in a real sense, out of place. Removed from the landscape and the cultural context that produced it, turned into an object of scholarly study and aesthetic appreciation, rather than the working document it was created to be. There is no perfect solution to this tension. Both preservation and context matter. The tablets need to be protected, and they also need to be understood in relation to the world they came from. The best we can do is to be aware of what is gained and what is lost in each approach, to make the tablets as accessible as possible both physically and intellectually, and to work toward conditions that would allow for safe preservation and display in Iraq, alongside the continuing preservation and study in institutions around the world. The question that the antediluvian tradition ultimately poses, the question that has run through this entire night's exploration, is not whether the 6 cities and their kings before the flood were real in any literal historical sense. The answer to that question is clear: they were not. The antediluvian world described in the Sumerian king list is a mythological construction, not a historical reality, and the impossible reigns of the antediluvian kings are symbolic expressions of the idea that the world before the flood was different from the present, operating on a different scale and according to different principles. The real question is what this mythological construction tells us about the people who created and preserved it, what needs it served, what understanding of the world it expressed, what kind of knowledge it was trying to preserve. And here the answers are rich and complex. The antediluvian tradition was a way of expressing the intuition that the world has a deep history extending back before the beginning of written records. It was a way of linking the present to a cosmic order that transcended the merely human and the merely historical. It was a way of making sense of catastrophic change by placing it in a larger framework of divine governance and cyclical renewal. It was a way of legitimating political authority by connecting current rulers to an institution that stretched back to the very beginning of the world. All of these functions were real and important, and all of them tell us something valuable about how the ancient Mesopotamians understood their world. The tradition was not primitive or naive. It was sophisticated and purposeful, constructed with care and transmitted with dedication across many generations. It reflected a historical consciousness that was both more mythological than ours and, in some ways, more attuned to the deep patterns of rise and fall that characterize the long arc of civilizations. Modern civilization likes to think of itself as different from all that came before, as having escaped the cycle of rise and fall through the power of science and technology, through the accumulated knowledge that is preserved not in fragile oral traditions or in tablets that can be buried and forgotten, but in books and digital archives that are distributed and redundant. And in some ways this confidence is justified. We do have tools for preserving and accessing knowledge that the ancient Mesopotamians could not have imagined. We do understand the world in ways that allow for a kind of cumulative progress that was not possible in earlier eras. But the fate of the cuneiform tablets, buried and forgotten for 2,000 years, their knowledge locked away and inaccessible until the right combination of archaeological discovery and scholarly effort could recover it, is a reminder that no form of preservation is perfect, that knowledge can be lost even when it seems most secure, that the institutions and practices that transmit culture across generations are always fragile and always dependent on specific social and political conditions that can change or disappear. The tablets survived because they were made of clay, because they were buried in dry conditions that prevented their disintegration, and because they were eventually found by people who recognized their significance and had the tools to decode them. Any of these conditions could have failed, and if they had, the knowledge would have been lost permanently. This fragility is worth keeping in mind as we think about our own efforts to preserve knowledge and culture for the future. Digital archives seem infinitely more robust than clay tablets, They can be copied instantly, distributed globally, backed up redundantly. But they also depend on technological infrastructure that is complex and vulnerable, on file formats that can become obsolete, on institutions that can fail or lose funding, on knowledge of how to access and interpret the data that is not always well distributed. The cuneiform tablets have survived for 4,000 years. It is not at all clear that our digital archives will survive for 400, let alone 4,000. The lesson of the antediluvian tradition, and the tablets that preserve it, is not that we should go back to writing on clay. It is that we should approach the task of preserving knowledge for the future with humility and with an awareness that no system is perfect, that redundancy and diversity in preservation methods are valuable, and that the work of transmission, the patient, careful, generation after generation work of teaching, copying, translating, interpreting, and caring for the material remains of the past, is work that never ends, and that each generation must take up anew. The night was deep now, and the stars turned slowly overhead in their ancient patterns that had been mapped by Babylonian astronomers, recorded in cuneiform tablets, used to construct the mathematical systems that organized time and predicted celestial events. The same stars that had watched over the creation of the tablets now watched over their preservation in museums and their study by scholars, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath them, marking out the passage of time with the same precision they had always maintained. In a library somewhere, perhaps, a student was encountering the antediluvian tradition for the first time, reading a translation of the Sumerian king list, puzzling over the impossible numbers, trying to understand what the ancient compilers had meant. The spark of curiosity that had driven the Sumerian scribes to preserve the tradition was kindling again in a new mind, in a new generation, in a context so different from the original that the scribes could not have imagined it. But the essential act, reaching back into the past, trying to understand, trying to preserve and transmit what was learned, was the same. This continuity of intellectual effort across the vast gulf of time is perhaps the deepest legacy of the cuneiform tradition. The scribes of Nippur who copied the king list 4,000 years ago, and the scholars of today who study it are engaged in the same fundamental work, the work of preserving memory, of making the past accessible to the present, of maintaining the chain of transmission that connects each generation to what came before. The tools are different, the languages are different, the institutional frameworks are different, but the underlying commitment is the same, and in that continuity there is something profoundly moving. The sense that the human project of understanding and remembering the past is larger than any individual lifetime or any individual civilization, that it connects us across time to people we will never meet but with whom we share fundamental concerns and fundamental values. The scribe in Nippur pressing signs into wet clay, and the scholar in Oxford examining a photograph of those signs on a computer screen are separated by 4 millennia and by almost every aspect of their material and cultural worlds. But they are also connected by the tablet itself, by the knowledge it carries, by the shared understanding that the past matters and that preserving it is worth the effort. As the night deepened and the room grew quiet, the invitation to rest came gently, like a hand on the shoulder at the end of a long journey. The story of the antediluvian tradition had been told, the story of how it was created, how it was preserved, how it was lost, how it was found again. The tablets that carried the tradition were resting in their cases, in their storage drawers, in their controlled environments, protected now by the care of modern conservators after their long sleep in the earth. The tradition itself was resting in the minds of the scholars who had spent their lives studying it, and in the minds of the people who had encountered it, and found in it something that spoke to them across the millennia. Let the ceiling fan turn softly in its circular path, the same path it has traced 1,000 times tonight, and will trace 1,000 times more. Let the breath slow and deepen, finding its own rhythm, the rhythm that belongs to sleep and to the quiet spaces between waking thoughts. Let the images from tonight's journey settle gently in the mind, the flat plain of ancient Sumer, the walls of sun-dried brick, the scribal student bent over his tablet, the careful pressing of reed into clay, the patient accumulation of signs that became words and words that became stories and stories that became the memory of a civilization. The world before the flood, whatever it was, historical or mythological, real or imagined, has been swept away by time as surely as the antediluvian cities were swept away by the waters in the ancient story. But the memory remains, pressed into clay, preserved through the darkness, recovered and read and understood and passed on. The chain of transmission holds. The tradition continues. The past speaks to the present in the same quiet voice it has always used. The voice of marks on clay, of patient scholarship, of minds reaching back across time to touch other minds and find there something familiar, something human, something that endures. The stars continue their slow wheel overhead, the same stars that have watched over all the rises and falls of all the civilizations that have come and gone beneath them. The same stars that will be there when the present age has passed into the past, when our cities have become mounds waiting to be excavated, when our own records, whatever form they take, however carefully we preserve them, wait in their own darkness for their own rediscovery by future people whose faces and languages we cannot imagine. The earth turns, the night deepens, the past rests peacefully in its clay vessels and in the care of those who tend its memory. And the present moment, this moment, settles into its own place in the long succession of moments that stretches back to the beginning and forward to the end, part of a pattern too large to see from inside but visible, perhaps, from the patient vantage point of the stars. Rest easy knowing that the work of memory continues, that the chain of transmission holds, that the past is preserved not perfectly but sufficiently, and that tomorrow will bring its own quiet opportunities to reach back, to understand, to preserve, and to pass on. The tablet rests, the tradition rests, and you too can rest, as the night turns gently around you and the ancient rhythms of earth and sky continue their patient work. Sleep well.